From massive scandals to real backstage fights, from forgotten championship belts to wrestlers breaking character, this is 2 hours of insane WWE stories, starting with the darkest scandals in WWE history. For decades, Vince McMahon was untouchable. He survived steroid trials, controversies, and countless backstage incidents. But in 2022, everything came crashing down when reports surfaced that Vince had secretly paid over $12 million to 4 different women over a 16-year period. These payments were made to cover up allegations of inappropriate conduct, and they were kept completely off WWE's official books. The biggest known payment was $7.5 million to a former WWE contractor who claimed Vince coerced her into a relationship before pushing her out of the company. Another $3 million went to a former paralegal he allegedly had an affair with. The SEC launched a federal investigation, and by 2024, they charged McMahon for failing to disclose nearly $15 million in company-related expenses. Vince settled by paying a $400,000 fine and reimbursing WWE $1.3 million. However, the situation got even worse. In January 2024, former WWE employee Janelle Grant filed a lawsuit with disturbing allegations. She claimed that Vince and executive John Laurinaitis exploited her and treated her like property, passing her around to help recruit other talent, and all the incidents occurred right inside WWE headquarters. She also claimed the company tried to silence her with non-disclosure agreements, and the fallout was catastrophic. Vince was forced to resign from TKO, effectively ending his decades-long control over the wrestling empire he built. The man who created WrestleMania and turned wrestling into a billion-dollar business was pushed out of his own company due to dark accusations that finally ended his reign of power. But Vince's legal troubles weren't new. 3 decades earlier, he faced charges that could have destroyed WWE entirely. In the early 1990s, the federal government came after Vince McMahon with serious accusations that threatened to send him to prison for over a decade. He was charged with allegedly distributing steroids to his wrestlers to make them look bigger and more marketable. If convicted and given the maximum sentence, Vince was looking at 11 years behind bars and a $1.5 million fine. This wasn't just about Vince's finances. It was about WWE's survival. If the chairman went to prison, the company would most likely collapse. The trial became a media spectacle. Hulk Hogan, WWE's biggest star at the time, was called to testify under oath. Another wrestler named Nails testified that McMahon had actively pressured him to take steroids, though many believed he was exaggerating due to personal issues with Vince. Despite the damning testimony, the jury found Vince not guilty, shocking everyone who thought the chairman was certainly getting convicted. WWE immediately announced a wellness policy with drug testing, but it was weak and poorly enforced. Fast forward to 2007, and the steroid issue came back to haunt WWE again. The U.S. Congress demanded WWE present documents about their drug policies and threatened federal intervention. Although no charges came from this investigation, the pressure forced Vince to finally implement a legit wellness policy, and WWE shifted toward the family-friendly PG era to rehabilitate their image. But speaking of WWE's wild antics in the early 2000s, nothing exemplified it more than one infamous flight from England. In May 2002, WWE had just finished the Insurrection pay-per-view in the UK and chartered a plane to bring the entire roster back to the United States. What should have been a routine 7-hour flight turned into absolute chaos that would become infamous for all the wrong reasons. One of the most dangerous incidents involved Curt Hennig and Brock Lesnar. The two got into a fight in the aisle of the plane, throwing punches and grappling dangerously close to the emergency exit door. Multiple wrestlers, including Triple H, Finlay, and Paul Heyman, had to physically intervene to separate them before someone got seriously hurt or worse, breached the door mid-flight. Hennig was fired shortly after the incident, but that wasn't even the craziest part of the day. Road agent Michael Hayes and JBL got into a physical altercation that ended with Hayes getting his signature mullet cut off by X-Pac. Scott Hall was also terminated after becoming extremely intoxicated and making crude comments to flight attendants. Dustin Rhodes allegedly serenaded his ex-wife Terry, who was also on the flight, making everyone uncomfortable. The whole incident became known as the plane ride from hell, and it forced WWE to completely overhaul their backstage policies and behavior standards for wrestlers during travel. But from backstage chaos to in-ring tragedy, few moments in wrestling history are as heartbreaking as what happened on May 23, 1999. Owen Hart was one of the most beloved wrestlers of the 90s. But on that night at the Over the Edge pay-per-view in Kansas City, everything went tragically wrong. Owen was scheduled to make a comedic entrance as his Blue Blazer character, being lowered from the arena rafters down into the ring. It was meant to be a light-hearted moment, poking fun at rival WCW's Sting's entrance. But the quick-release mechanism on his safety harness malfunctioned and triggered way too early. Owen fell nearly 80 feet, hitting the top rope chest first before crashing onto the mat. The live crowd initially thought it was part of the show, but as medical personnel rushed to the ring and attempted to revive Owen, the horrifying reality set in. Owen was rushed to the hospital where he was pronounced dead from internal bleeding. He was just 34 years old, in the prime of his career, and had a wife and 2 young children at home. What made the tragedy even more controversial was WWE's decision to continue the pay-per-view. Despite one of their performers dying in the ring early in the broadcast, Vince McMahon made the call to keep going. Announcer Jim Ross had to inform viewers at home of Owen's passing while the show continued around them. Fans in attendance were confused and angry, many not finding out what actually happened until later. Wrestlers were visibly shaken. Owen's widow, Martha Hart, was rightfully furious. She sued WWE for negligence, arguing that the dangerous stunt was unnecessary and poorly executed. Martha has remained highly critical of WWE ever since, refusing to allow the company to use Owen's name for years. But if Owen Hart's death was wrestling's darkest in-ring moment, what happened in June 2007 shook the industry like never before. Chris Benoit was one of the most respected technical wrestlers in the world. His 20-year career had taken him from Japan to WCW to WWE, where he finally achieved his dream by winning the World Heavyweight Championship at WrestleMania 20. Benoit was known for his intensity, his work ethic, and his dedication to the craft, which is why what happened next was so incomprehensible. On June 24, 2007, Benoit was scheduled to appear at WWE Vengeance to face CM Punk for the ECW Championship. But he no-showed the event, which was completely out of character for someone as reliable as Benoit. WWE officials and his friends in the locker room immediately knew something was wrong. When police arrived at Benoit's home, they discovered a scene that would horrify the world. Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their 7-year-old son Daniel were all deceased. At first, authorities thought they might be looking at a home invasion or some kind of external attack. But as the investigation continued, the dark truth emerged. Chris Benoit had taken the lives of his wife and young son before ending his own life over the course of a weekend. The wrestling world was absolutely devastated. Fans wondered how someone who seemed so dedicated and professional could do something so horrible. The answer came months later when doctors examined Benoit's brain. Decades of unprotected chair shots to the head, diving headbutts, and countless concussions had literally destroyed his brain tissue. Benoit had severe CTE. His brain showed damage consistent with someone in their 80s suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease. WWE erased Benoit from its history completely. Video packages stopped mentioning him, his matches were pulled from highlight reels, and his name disappeared from WWE forever. The company faced massive criticism for their concussion protocols and how they'd allowed wrestlers to compete with head injuries for years. The tragedy forced huge changes across the entire wrestling industry. The number of chair shots to the head dropped dramatically, and certain moves like Benoit's diving headbutt were essentially banned. The Chris Benoit tragedy remains the most horrifying chapter in professional wrestling history, a reminder that the toll of this business goes far beyond what fans see on television. But switching gears from the Benoit incident, let's talk about how one of WWE's biggest female stars was pushed out of the company for falling in love with the wrong person. Chyna was a revolutionary who broke every barrier for women in wrestling. She was a founding member of DX, a former Intercontinental Champion, and one of the most popular stars of the Attitude Era. But her WWE career came to a crushing end because of a love triangle that destroyed her personally and professionally. Chyna and Triple H started dating in the late 1990s while both were rising stars in WWE. They were one of wrestling's power couples, both on-screen and off. But according to multiple sources, everything fell apart when Triple H allegedly began a relationship with Stephanie McMahon while still with Chyna. The situation was messy, painful, and happened right under everyone's nose in WWE. Chyna's sister later revealed in interviews that the breakup devastated her. She said that Triple H and Chyna had disagreements about starting a family, with Triple H wanting children and Chyna not ready for that step. Chyna also struggled with substance issues and mental health problems that complicated everything. But the real betrayal came when she tried to address the situation with Vince McMahon directly. According to reports, Chyna confronted Vince about what had happened between Triple H and Stephanie. But instead of supporting her or at least staying neutral, Vince essentially told her not to make trouble about it. When her contract came up for renewal in 2001, WWE simply chose not to renegotiate. She was released from the company unceremoniously after everything she'd done to help build the Attitude Era. The aftermath was tragic as Chyna struggled for years after leaving WWE, dealing with financial problems, addiction issues, and feeling betrayed by the company she'd dedicated her life to. She passed away in 2016 at just 45 years old. Triple H and Stephanie went on to get married and eventually take over WWE together, running the company after Vince's departure. For years, WWE refused to induct Chyna into the Hall of Fame, with Triple H awkwardly having to explain why during interviews. However, this wasn't the only scandal Triple H was part of. In May 1996, at a house show in Madison Square Garden, 4 of WWE's biggest stars did something that was absolutely forbidden. They destroyed kayfabe, the unspoken agreement that wrestling's rivalries and storylines were real, right in front of a live audience. The 4 men involved were Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Triple H. In real life, they were best friends known as The Clique, a backstage group with booking influence in WWE. But on TV, they were presented as bitter rivals. They were never supposed to acknowledge their real friendship publicly. But this particular night was special. It was the final WWE appearance for Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, who were leaving for WCW. After their matches ended, all 4 men gathered in the ring and shared an emotional group embrace as the MSG crowd looked on in confusion. They were openly showing that the rivalries were fake. Unlike today's social media age, where wrestlers air their entire lives on TikTok, in 1996, this was a massive deal. WWE and all wrestling promotions worked extremely hard to maintain kayfabe, to keep fans believing that what they saw on TV was real. Wrestlers who were enemies on screen would literally avoid being seen together in public. The business was built on this illusion, and the Clique had just shattered it in one of wrestling's most famous venues. Vince McMahon was absolutely furious when he found out, but he couldn't really punish everyone involved. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were already gone to WCW. Shawn Michaels was WWE's top star and champion. That left only Triple H to take the fall for all of them. The game was buried as punishment, losing matches and momentum. The plan had been for him to win the King of the Ring tournament in June 1996, which would have given him a major push toward main event status. Instead, WWE gave that spot to Stone Cold Steve Austin, who delivered his famous Austin 3:16 promo and launched the character that would define the Attitude Era. The curtain call looked like a career-killing mistake for Triple H at the time, but it accidentally created the biggest star in wrestling history. Sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures. But speaking of the McMahon family and controversial relationships, let's talk about wrestling's biggest backstage gossip from the 90s. Randy Savage was one of the biggest stars during the 80s and early 90s. But in 1994, Savage suddenly left WWE for WCW, and something strange happened. He never came back. Even after WCW closed in 2001 and WWE bought their tape library and contracts, Savage never returned. He wasn't acknowledged on WWE television, he wasn't invited back for appearances, and most suspiciously, he wasn't inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame despite clearly deserving it. Other legends like Hogan and even Bret Hart eventually reconciled with WWE, but not Randy Savage, and fans demanded to know why. The official explanation was that Vince took it personally when Savage jumped to WCW, viewing it as a betrayal. But many fans didn't buy that. This started the backstage rumor that Randy Savage had an inappropriate relationship with Stephanie McMahon in the early 1990s after Savage divorced Miss Elizabeth. Vince found out about it, and that's the real reason Savage was essentially blacklisted from WWE for the rest of his life. What added fuel to this conspiracy theory was an incident in 2004. Triple H, who was married to Stephanie by then, made some disparaging comments about Randy Savage during a promo. Savage responded by posting videos online where he made suggestive remarks that seemed to hint at their alleged past. To this day, nobody from WWE or the McMahon family has ever directly addressed this scandal. But going from dark scandals, up next, let's look at the wild incidents when WWE matches went off script turned into real fights. Most WWE matches have a plan, but sometimes that plan goes out of the window and the fight turns very real. From chaotic brawls to legit stabbings, these are wrestling matches that turned into real fights. Starting with the time Braun Strowman found out exactly why you don't mess with the Beast. During their match at the 2018 Royal Rumble, Strowman accidentally caught Lesnar with a knee to the face. Brock, being Brock, responded with a real right hand that snapped Strowman's skull back. Strowman later opened up about what happened and said both men were chill backstage about the incident, but for a brief moment during that match, Lesnar had Strowman seeing stars. But while Strowman walked out that night without any significant damage, this next wrestler literally stabbed his opponent with a knife. By 2004, New Jack had already built a career out of chaos. A man who once fell off a 20-foot scaffold, suffered brain damage, and kept wrestling. In October 2004, he was booked for a small independent show in Florida, run by Thunder Wrestling Federation. His opponent was William Jason Lane, an untrained local with almost no wrestling experience. During the match, Lane began throwing real punches at New Jack's face. Whether Lane thought that was part of the deal or was simply out of his depth, New Jack decided he wasn't going to have any of it. He reached into the pocket of his camouflage gear and pulled out a real blade. Then he stabbed Lane 9 times in the head. New Jack was arrested and charged with aggravated assault. He later claimed the two had agreed beforehand to use a piece of metal to draw blood, and that Lane had understood what he was signing up for. The charges were eventually dropped. New Jack claims he negotiated that outcome by agreeing to train Lane, but he left Florida immediately and never held up his end of that deal. But while this incident took place at an indie event in front of barely dozens of fans, this next fight happened in front of millions on global TV when a rookie trying to make a name for himself almost ended a legend's career in the process. In 2004, WWE was filming a Tough Enough segment where Kurt Angle challenged the contestants to a shoot match. The plan was for Kurt to steamroll through a bunch of rookies and establish himself as a dominant heel. But then, Daniel Puder entered the chat. Puder was a trained MMA fighter with a background in submission grappling. He was fresh, focused, and had absolutely nothing to lose. After a brief scramble, Puder caught Angle's right arm and wrenched it into a Kimura lock. Angle's arm was bending the wrong way. Puder later said flat out that he was trying to snap it off. And the terrifying part was that he almost did. Angle, who had just come off neck surgery, was completely exposed. The referee saw what was happening and had maybe 2 seconds to save the situation. He noticed Puder's shoulders were technically on the mat, and he counted to 3 fast. Angle was declared the winner on a pinfall that barely made sense, but it didn't matter. Backstage, Angle was furious. Puder had no remorse, but the locker room remembered. When Puder entered the 2005 Royal Rumble a few months later, veterans Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, and Hardcore Holly chopped him so hard he practically begged to be eliminated. That was Puder's punishment for breaking one of wrestling's sacred unwritten rules. You don't go into business for yourself. But it's not just men who go off script, even the women have had their fair share of shoot fights. In August 2021, Charlotte Flair faced Nia Jax in what was supposed to be a routine match. Nothing on paper suggested it would become one of the most talked about matches in women's wrestling. But something went wrong during a commercial break. Something the TV audience mostly missed. Jax later revealed that Charlotte started laying into her with shots that were noticeably stiff. She warned her verbally to chill out, but Charlotte didn't stop. Jax described being so angry in that moment that she couldn't even hear the arena. Both women briefly stared each other down, and for a few seconds, nobody knew how this was going to end. They managed to pull it back together and finish as planned, but make no mistake, for a stretch in the middle of that match, a match on an episode of Raw had turned into a real shoot fight. Backstage, both women walked away from each other and cooled down. Jax checked on Charlotte. Charlotte confirmed she was fine, and producer Devon Dudley stepped in to smooth things over. But while Charlotte and Jax eventually worked it out, this next one is the story of a rookie getting schooled by a veteran. Russ McCullough was a 350-pound, almost 7 feet tall giant who happened to be a former NFL offensive lineman. He was signed as a developmental prospect and spent time in multiple territories, including Ohio Valley Wrestling and the Heartland Wrestling Association. But McCullough had a reputation for being difficult and careless with his opponents. That reputation caught up with him in 2001 during a match in the HWA. McCullough was in the ring with Rikishi, one of the veterans on the main WWE roster. During the match, McCullough was supposed to release Rikishi so Rikishi would move and Haku would kick him instead. But McCullough didn't let go at the right time. Haku's kick landed flush on Rikishi. From there, Rikishi grabbed a steel chair and hit McCullough with it 6 times. The last shot caught him directly in the face. McCullough left the ringside area and walked up the ramp, done for the night. He was released from his developmental contract shortly after, and his wrestling career was practically over. Years later, McCullough joined a class action lawsuit against WWE over brain damage sustained during his time with the company. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, but the whole saga stands as a reminder of what happens when you haven't earned the right to take liberties, and you try anyway. However, if the Rikishi incident was ugly, the APA delivered a masterclass in what happens when the boys in the locker room can't stand you. Johnny Grunge and Rocco Rock had been one of the hottest tag teams in ECW. When WWF signed them in early 1999, it should have been a fresh chapter. Instead, they walked into a locker room that already had no time for them. The backstage resentment ran deep. The Attitude Era WWF roster was a tight-knit hierarchy, and Public Enemy had previously passed on the company to sign with WCW back in 1995. When they showed up in 1999, the roster remembered their choice. What made it worse was the attitude they brought with them. That chip on their shoulder became a full-blown problem on March 7th in Pittsburgh. They had a match with the Acolytes, but Bradshaw and Farouk walked through the curtain with a different plan entirely. Referee Jimmy Corderas, standing in the ring waiting for the match to start, said he could tell from the APA's faces what was coming. The moment they hit the ring, it was a mugging. There were no tags, no structure, it was just two large, angry men beating the life out of their opponents. Chairs, tables, steel steps. It was uncomfortable to watch. The match didn't end on a pinfall. The bell just rang to stop it. The ref noted that even Jack Briscoe on the headset called for the bell, but the APA kept going. But while the APA brought the attitude and Public Enemy paid the price, this next one is about the time a UFC champion met one of the stiffest workers of all time. When Ken Shamrock signed with the WWF in 1997, he was already one of the most feared fighters on the planet. He had a reputation for breaking people with submissions before they even had time to tap. He understood combat, but what he didn't understand yet was the difference between a real fight and a professional wrestling match. Shamrock's in-ring debut came in a no-holds-barred, submission or knockout-only match against Vader. The rules were meant to bridge Shamrock's MMA background with pro wrestling, but they also meant there were no safety rails. Vader was a monster of a man and a stiff worker. He could take a shot, but nobody had prepared him for the type of shots Shamrock was about to unleash. Midway through the match, Shamrock fired a series of knee strikes to Vader's face and broke Vader's nose. Shamrock admitted later that he had no idea and said he was just doing what felt normal to him. Vader didn't pull back either. He unloaded a lariat that nearly took Shamrock's head off. The crowd assumed it was all part of the show, but it wasn't. Shamrock later put Vader in an ankle lock and made him tap out to win the match. Vader was angry, but he didn't escalate the situation backstage. Instead, he got his revenge a couple of months later when Shamrock and Vader faced off once again, this time in Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling in Japan. Shamrock was working the match with a legit rib injury, and things got even worse when Vader powerbombed him so hard that he started coughing blood. But while the Shamrock-Vader situation was a collision of two legit tough men, what happened between Perry Saturn and Mike Bell was a completely different scene. Perry Saturn was a former Army Ranger, a veteran of ECW and WCW, and one of the founding members of the Radicals alongside Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, and Eddie Guerrero. He was serious, intense, and not someone who took sloppiness in the ring lightly. Mike Bell, on the other hand, was a jobber hired specifically to make his opponents look good. On May 17, 2001, he was booked to lose to Saturn in a few minutes. It was supposed to be a standard match, but Bell made a critical mistake. Bell botched a hip toss early in the match, sending Saturn awkwardly to the mat and landing him on his head and neck. It was clumsy, it was careless, and Perry Saturn snapped. He immediately began firing legit punches at Bell, dropped him with real strikes, and then hurled him out of the ring with full force. Bell landed on his head on the arena floor, but Saturn wasn't done. He went outside and drove Bell into the steel steps. Bell wasn't seriously injured, which was more luck than anything else. But that didn't save Saturn from the consequences. Vince McMahon was waiting when he got back. Saturn later admitted he knew immediately he'd crossed a line. His punishment was unique in wrestling history. WWE gave him a gimmick where he fell in love with a mop. The crowd actually got behind it, but that was beside the point. It was humiliation in public, designed to send a message to everyone in the locker room about what happens when you go into business for yourself. Saturn was released in 2002 and never recovered his standing in the industry. Mike Bell passed away in 2008. The story didn't end well for either man. But while Saturn clearly crossed a line, the Goldberg-Regal situation is murkier, and 2 decades later, both men still tell different versions of the story. By early 1998, Bill Goldberg was one of the hottest things in pro wrestling. While Austin was raising hell against McMahon in the WWF, Goldberg's undefeated streak was generating eyeballs for WCW. Every match followed the same formula. Walk out like a badass, spear, jackhammer, pin. Done in under 2 minutes, and the WCW crowd loved it. But what the crowd didn't know was how limited Goldberg actually was. Those squash matches had made him look like a god, and hidden the fact that he'd never been tested past 90 seconds. William Regal decided it was time to fix that. As a veteran of British wrestling, where you worked in carnival booths against real challengers and had to actually handle yourself, Regal was old school in the truest sense. Before the match, according to Regal, an agent told them to go out and have a competitive 6-minute match. The bell rang, and Regal immediately started working a British-style match with holds and European uppercuts that were stiff but controlled. The problem was that Goldberg had never done anything like this. Every time Regal set something up, Goldberg just stood there. Regal later said he kept hitting him with strikes just to get a response and keep the match moving. The result was one of the strangest things ever broadcast on Nitro. Goldberg looked lost. Regal looked like he was wrestling himself. The crowd, used to watching Goldberg destroy people in 90 seconds, had no idea what was happening. Backstage, Eric Bischoff was furious. He blamed Regal for making his top star look bad. The match, as awkward as it was, might just be the best technical match of Goldberg's career. But going from matches turning into real fights, up next, let's look at the times WWE wrestlers got into real fights backstage. Everyone sees the punches, slams, and chair shots on TV. But some of the most violent moments in WWE history didn't happen inside the ring. They happened in the hallways, locker rooms, and in one case, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. In this video, we're looking at the times WWE wrestlers got into real fights backstage, starting with the night Chris Jericho had enough of Goldberg's attitude. The bad blood between Jericho and Goldberg went back years. In WCW, Jericho had spent months trying to get a program with Goldberg, but Goldberg never saw Jericho as a worthy opponent for a main event program. By 2003, Goldberg had signed with WWE, and by then, Jericho was already an established main eventer. But the old tension hadn't gone anywhere. The problem ignited when Jericho saw Goldberg and Kevin Nash laughing during one of his segments. Whether they were actually mocking him or just happened to be smiling at the wrong moment didn't matter much. Jericho had been waiting for this confrontation for years. He walked straight into the locker room, stood in front of Goldberg, looked him in the eyes, and told him directly, if he had something to say it to his face. Goldberg charged him, and that was his mistake. Jericho was a lifelong hockey player raised in a fighting household and not the type to panic when someone bigger came at him. He got Goldberg into a front face lock and held him there until other wrestlers pulled them apart. When they separated, the fight started again, but Jericho got the upper hand again. Goldberg wasn't popular in that locker room to begin with. He was a WCW guy getting a massive push on arrival, and most of the roster was already cold toward him. But a decade after Jericho's altercation with Goldberg, the Ayatollah of Rock and Rolla found himself face-to-face with the Beast. At SummerSlam 2016, Brock Lesnar faced Randy Orton in the main event. Toward the end of the match, Lesnar removed his gloves and opened Orton up the hard way with elbows to the skull, leaving him a bloody mess on the canvas. Jericho was watching and had no idea if the finish was planned or if Lesnar had simply gone into business for himself. As Lesnar came through the curtain at the gorilla position, Jericho loudly expressed his frustration and Brock didn't hold back. Lesnar shoved Jericho. Jericho shoved him back, hard, right into the wall. But then it got stranger. Brock told Jericho to hit him or kiss him, trying to goad him into swinging first. Triple H tried to get between them, but both men told him to back off. Then Vince McMahon stepped in and finally revealed that the finish had been planned all along. Jericho later admitted during an interview with Chris Van Vliet that he had his own plan if things escalated. He decided he was going to bite Lesnar's nose off. He figured Brock might break his face, but Brock would spend the rest of his life without a nose. But while Lesnar and Jericho's backstage fight didn't escalate, another wrestler tried to mess around with Lesnar and found out exactly what happens you poke the beast. In May 2002, WWE had just finished a UK tour and chartered a flight back from London to New York. The company provided an open bar, and that was the biggest mistake. By the time the plane was somewhere over the Atlantic, the alcohol had done its work. Among the wrestlers on board was Curt Hennig, a veteran with a lifelong reputation as the locker room prankster. Also on the flight was Brock Lesnar, barely a year into his WWE career, still a rookie and carrying that quiet, coiled energy he always had. Hennig started goading Lesnar about who was the better amateur wrestler, ribbing him repeatedly until it escalated into a scuffle in the aisle of the plane. Matt Hardy, sitting near the emergency exit, watched the whole thing. Hennig kept trying to make peace, offering handshakes and apologies, then stomping on Lesnar's bare feet the moment Lesnar let his guard down. When Lesnar caught up to him, it stopped being a prank. He picked Hennig up and drove him into the emergency exit door while the plane was cruising over the ocean. Triple H, Fit Finlay, and Paul Heyman had to physically separate them. WWE fired Hennig upon landing. Lesnar received no punishment as Vince had already primed him for a massive push. The cruel footnote is that Hennig passed away less than a year after the incident. Two men who genuinely cared about each other, and a dumb drunk brawl on a plane was the last chapter of their story together. But if the Lesnar-Hennig story was about a prank that went too far, this one is about two men who loved each other like brothers and occasionally fought the same way. Kurt Angle and Eddie Guerrero had been allies before becoming rivals. By 2004, they were in the middle of a heated program, and Angle was running a heel faction alongside Luther Reigns and Mark Jindrak. The plan for that night's show for the faction was to go out, rough up Eddie and Chavo, and generate heat for the ongoing feud. The problem was that Angle never actually touched Eddie. His job was to attack Chavo. It was Reigns and Jindrak who laid into Guerrero. But when they came through the curtain at gorilla position, Eddie was furious. He accused Angle of stiffing him for real. Angle insisted that he hadn't laid a hand on him. Eddie pushed him. Angle warned him to stop, but Eddie pushed him again. Angle shoved back, and Eddie went straight for a double leg takedown. Against almost anyone else, a takedown would be effective. Against an Olympic gold medalist, not so much. Angle got Eddie in a front headlock and started choking him out. The Big Show walked in and solved the problem the way only a 7-foot giant can. He picked both men up and carried them to opposite sides of the room like they were children. Then came round 2. Angle went to Eddie's locker room to apologize, but Eddie told him he wasn't ready to accept it. Angle lost his temper again and the punches started flying. JBL pulled them apart this time. The next day, it was like it never happened. Angle later said he considered Eddie one of the best human beings he ever knew. That complicated, combustible friendship was exactly what made their matches feel so special. But while Angle and Eddie made up later, things didn't work out as smoothly between CM Punk and the Elite. CM Punk had a solid run in AEW with feuds against MJF, Eddie Kingston, and even becoming world champion. However, his backstage incidents often overshadowed anything he did in the ring. Punk had issues with Adam Page making personal jabs at him in promos. He believed the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, who held executive vice president roles on top of their wrestling careers, were leaking negative stories about him to the media. Tensions were already near the surface when AEW ran All Out in Chicago on September 4, 2022. Punk won the World Championship that night. Then he sat down at the post-show press conference next to Tony Khan and detonated. He went after Adam Page on the microphone, calling him an empty-headed fool. He accused the EVPs of being irresponsible and said they couldn't manage a retail store, let alone a wrestling company. Tony Khan said nothing and sat beside him in silence. Reportedly, the Elite walked to Punk's locker room after the scrum to confront him about his comments. What happened next is where the accounts split. Punk's side claimed they kicked the door down. The Elite's side said they simply opened it. But what nobody disputes is what came next. Punk swung first, throwing punches at Matt Jackson. Ace Steel, Punk's trainer and longtime friend who was working as a producer, threw a chair that caught Nick Jackson in the eye. Steel also bit Kenny Omega and grabbed him by the hair. The fight lasted roughly 6 minutes before security broke it up. All titles were vacated. Everyone involved was suspended. Ace Steel was eventually released. Chris Jericho reportedly went to Punk afterward and told him he was a cancer to the locker room. Punk eventually returned in June 2023 on the debut of Collision. But less than 3 months later, it was time for round 2. The build-up to the second incident came from a dispute over Jack Perry wanting to use real glass on Collision. Punk used his backstage authority to stop it, which Perry didn't take well. At the All-In event in London, Perry used real glass anyway during his match, stared into the camera, and sent a direct message to Punk watching backstage. When Perry walked through the curtain moments before Punk was due to go out for his own match, a confrontation started. It turned physical before Samoa Joe and others pulled them apart. Tony Khan fired Punk 9 days later following an internal investigation. Perry wasn't fired but vanished from television for a long time. Today, CM Punk is a main eventer in WWE, while Jack Perry continues to perform in AEW's midcard. Whether we get another round or not remains to be seen. We already know about the Lesnar and Hennig incident on that flight from London, but there was another incident on that same plane that night, and this one had a very different feel to it. It started with the chairman, Vince McMahon. McMahon had a long-standing habit of trying to prove he could wrestle. At some point before the flight, he jumped Kurt Angle from behind backstage, as a joke, and managed to take him down. Then, the way Vince operates, he didn't let it go. He made sure Angle knew, and made sure everyone else knew, that he was the only man in WWE history to have taken down an Olympic gold medalist. Angle eventually decided to settle the score on the plane. He took McMahon down in the aisle mid-flight. McMahon loved it. He'd been wanting to go again anyway, so he kept coming back, and the two of them kept wrestling each other in the narrow corridor between the seats. Everyone around them was watching, cheering, making noise. But there was another man on the flight who wasn't thrilled by the whole fiasco. The Undertaker was asleep at the back of the plane, nursing an ear injury. All the noise woke him up, and he made his way toward the commotion and found Kurt Angle on top of Vince McMahon. Undertaker didn't stop to ask questions. He was the locker room leader. Vince was his boss and his friend. What he saw looked like a real attack. He grabbed Angle from behind and choked him out right there on the plane. Only after releasing the hold did Undertaker understand what had actually been happening. Angle bore no grudge. He later said the incident left him with a healthy fear of The Undertaker, which probably served him well in the ring. The two went on to have some of the best matches of that era together, including a classic at No Way Out 2006. But while the situation between Angle and Taker was lighthearted, the same can't be said about this next backstage fight. In 1989, Rick Rude and the Ultimate Warrior were in the middle of a feud over the Intercontinental Championship. After one of their matches, Rude approached Warrior backstage and made a simple request for him to stop being so stiff in the ring. He wasn't looking for a confrontation. He was asking, professionally, to not be worked so stiff. Warrior's response was immediate, and he told Rude he didn't have to change anything because he was the Ultimate Warrior. That was enough for Rude to snap. He knocked Warrior flat with a single punch. That was the end of the fight. One sentence, one punch, game over. Warrior genuinely seemed to believe his character gave him license to work however he wanted, regardless of what it did to the people across the ring from him. Rude, for all his on-screen vanity, was old school in the truest sense. If you couldn't get through to someone with words, you made your point with your fists. The two continued their program and kept performing together. Warrior went on to win the WWF Championship at WrestleMania 6. Rude went on to WCW and later held titles there. Neither man publicly made much of the incident during their careers, but everyone backstage knew. In a locker room full of massive egos, the story of someone finally shutting Warrior up with one shot traveled fast. And while we're talking of backstage fights, we simply can't ignore the cold night in Montreal. In October 1996, Bret Hart turned down a more lucrative offer from WCW and signed a 20-year contract with WWF out of loyalty to McMahon. Less than a year later, the WWF's finances were under pressure from the Monday Night Wars, and McMahon told Hart he could no longer honor the deal. He encouraged Hart to go back to WCW. His final WWF match would be the championship defense against Shawn Michaels at Survivor Series in Montreal. The problem was that Hart refused to drop the title to HBK in his home country because of their personal animosity. The two men went into that match with an agreed plan that it'd end in a disqualification, keeping the title on Hart so he could relinquish it on his own terms. Midway through the match, Michaels applied Hart's own sharpshooter on him. Under orders from McMahon at ringside, referee Earl Hebner rang the bell, even though Hart had not tapped out. Michaels was declared champion and the crowd erupted in fury. Hart spat directly in McMahon's face at ringside, began destroying camera equipment and monitors, and walked backstage. McMahon came to the locker room. He said he wanted to talk, but Hart had a different idea. He found a gap between McMahon's arms and came up with an uppercut that lifted his boss off the ground and put him out cold. Hart later said it was the greatest punch he ever threw and the best thing he ever did. This incident eventually served as the genesis for the Attitude Era and turned out to be a blessing in disguise for the WWF. For every iconic WWE championship belt like the Winged Eagle, there are dozens of titles that simply vanished into thin air. Kicking things off with the title that even most hardcore wrestling fans had no idea existed, the King of the Ring Championship. Now, you might be wondering, doesn't the King of the Ring winner usually just get a crown or a robe? Well, that is the standard. But in 1995, King Mabel decided that just the title of king wasn't enough. He needed an actual physical belt. The title actually looked pretty cool, but never made it to TV. Mabel mostly wore it to conventions and independent wrestling events, and to this day, the King of the Ring title remains one of wrestling's biggest hidden gems. But speaking of forgotten championships, did you know that the WWE used to have a Canadian Heavyweight Championship? The Canadian Heavyweight Championship existed for barely 6 months, yet its history is absolutely insane. In 1985, Vince McMahon was in full expansion mode, trying to take over every wrestling territory in North America. Canada, specifically Montreal, was one of his biggest targets. The problem was that Montreal already had a massively popular wrestling promotion called International Wrestling, and their top star was a guy named Dino Bravo. This guy was their homegrown hero, and basically International Wrestling's Hulk Hogan. So when Vince couldn't outright destroy the promotion, he did something clever. As part of a co-promotion deal between WWF and International Wrestling, Dino Bravo would wrestle for the WWF while being recognized as WWF Canadian Heavyweight Champion. The belt was supposed to lead to a huge title versus title match, with Bravo's Canadian title on the line against Hulk Hogan's World Championship. This was supposed to be the big money match that would finally cement WWF's dominance in Montreal. But Vince McMahon got cold feet. When it came time for the actual show in 1986, McMahon refused to let Hogan wrestle in Canada, fearing the Hulkster would be booed. He couldn't risk his golden boy taking any kind of loss, even to protect the Canadian market. Instead, Dino wrestled Big John Studd in a completely different match that nobody cared about. Bravo was furious. He'd been promised this huge main event, and Vince had pulled the rug out from under him at the last second. He quit the WWF entirely about a week later, and the Canadian Heavyweight Championship disappeared with him. International Wrestling eventually went bankrupt less than 2 years later. Dino Bravo came back to WWF, but by then there was no Canadian title and no mention of his past glory. But while the Canadian title was a mess, did you know that WWE had women's tag division back in the 1980s? The WWF Women's Tag Team Championships existed from 1983 all the way to 1989. The title was created during an era when WWE was still affiliated with promotions in Japan, and the belt would be defended across multiple countries, giving it international prestige. The first recognized champions were Princess Victoria and Velvet McIntyre, who won the titles in May 1983. What made these titles unique was their lineage. They technically started as NWA Women's Tag Team Championships before WWE bought the rights to the belts in 1984 and rebranded them. This gave the titles instant credibility since they weren't just created out of thin air. Throughout the mid-80s, these championships were actually featured pretty prominently, with legendary teams like the Glamour Girls and the Jumping Bomb Angels putting on some bangers. But despite this international prestige, WWE slowly lost interest in women's tag team wrestling. After the Jumping Bomb Angels and Glamour Girls had their final matches in early 1988, the titles just sort of disappeared from TV. Finally, in 1989, the company officially declared the titles abandoned without any ceremony or final match. When they brought back women's tag titles in 2019, they acted like it was this revolutionary new idea. They completely ignored the fact that women's tag championships had existed in their company 30 years earlier. The current titles have zero connection to the original lineage, which is a shame because those 1980s titles actually looked decent. But moving on from the golden era, let's talk about some obscure titles from the modern era. In 2011, Zack Ryder was stuck in jobber hell. He wasn't being used on television, wasn't winning matches, and management had basically given up on him. So Ryder started his own YouTube show called Z True Long Island Story, where he created his own storylines and feuds. And in true Ryder fashion, he created his own championship, the Internet Championship. This wasn't some fancy title. The belt looked like something you could order from a custom belt maker for a few $100. It had the old YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook logos on the side, and honestly, it looked exactly as cheesy as it sounds. But here's the shocking twist. Ryder's YouTube show became massively popular, getting hundreds of thousands of views per episode. Fans loved his underdog story and his willingness to take matters into his own hands. The Internet Championship became a symbol of Ryder's independence and creativity. WWE initially wanted nothing to do with it, but Ryder's popularity grew so large that they couldn't ignore him anymore. He started appearing on Raw, getting great crowd reactions, and eventually won the United States Championship. For a brief moment, Zack Ryder was over, and the Internet Championship was part of what got him there. However, once Ryder fell back down the card, the Internet Championship quietly disappeared. The WWF United States Tag Team Championships have such a convoluted history that even hardcore wrestling historians struggle to keep track of all the details. Back in 1958, the Capital Wrestling Corporation, which would eventually become WWE, was still part of the National Wrestling Alliance. During this era, they created the Northeast version of the NWA United States Tag Team Championships. The inaugural champions were Don Curtis and Mark Lewin, who won a tournament on July 1, 1958. Throughout the early 1960s, these titles were actually pretty significant within the territory. Wrestling legends like the Graham brothers became frequent champions and used the belts to establish themselves as one of the premier tag teams of that era. Champions would defend the belts regularly at major venues like Madison Square Garden, giving the titles prestige within the Northeastern wrestling scene. However, in 1967, the titles were just suddenly deactivated. The company never acknowledged them in retrospect, never included them in historical records, and most fans today have absolutely no idea they ever existed. But if tag titles can be forgotten, you'd think singles championships would be safer, right? When most fans think of US title, they think of John Cena or MVP or JBL, but the history of the US title goes far back. The United States Heavyweight Championship is proof that even prestigious-sounding singles titles can vanish into obscurity. The championship technically began in 1960 when Nature Boy Buddy Rogers was recognized as the Northeast version of the NWA United States Heavyweight Champion. Rogers held this championship until June 1961, when he vacated it after winning the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. A wrestler named Bobo Brazil was crowned the new WWF United States Heavyweight Champion on April 6, 1963. And thus began the Bobo Brazil era of the United States Championship, which is really what this belt should be remembered for. Bobo Brazil became synonymous with this title, winning it a record 7 times throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. His biggest rival during this period was The Sheik, and their feuds over the U.S. title became legendary in the territory. After Pedro Morales won the World Heavyweight Championship in 1971, he had to vacate the United States title, and guess who was awarded the belt? That's right, Bobo Brazil. Bobo held that championship for 5 straight years, from 1971 to 1976, before the title was officially deactivated in 1976. WWE moved forward with their Intercontinental and World Championships, and the U.S. title became a footnote that nobody remembered. It would take until 2003 before the company brought back a United States Championship, and even then, they used the WCW version of the belt rather than reviving their own forgotten title. While those classic titles faded into history over decades, some championships are forgotten almost immediately after being created. In 2018, WWE hosted the greatest Royal Rumble event in Saudi Arabia. Braun Strowman won the match and won a trophy, along with a title belt that looked like it would be perfect as the WWE Ireland Championship. But here's the problem. Nobody knew what to do with it after the show ended. It was just this random prop that Braun happened to have. Within a week, the belt completely disappeared from TV. The greatest Royal Rumble Championship existed for exactly 1 match and then vanished into the void. It's arguably the shortest-lived championship in WWE history, lasting less time than some wrestlers' entire careers. But from championships that lasted mere weeks to titles that somehow survived for 2 decades, let's talk about the strange history of the WWF Junior Heavyweight Championship. This belt has one of the strangest lifespans in wrestling history because it technically existed for 20 years, but barely anyone knew it was active for most of that time. The title was created in 1965 to give smaller wrestlers something to compete for, and it actually looked pretty dope. The inaugural champion was a wrestler named Johnny DeFazio, though some records claim it was actually a wrestler named Paul Perez. The championship was quietly retired in 1972 when DeFazio himself retired from wrestling, and for 6 years, the title sat in storage gathering dust. Then, in 1978, WWE decided to revive it as part of a working relationship with New Japan Pro Wrestling. Carlos Jose Estrada won the reactivated title by defeating Tony Garea in January 1978, but almost immediately, the belt was shipped off to Japan. From that point forward, the Junior Heavyweight Championship was primarily defended in New Japan, not in the actual WWF. Japanese wrestlers like Tatsumi Fujinami and the legendary Tiger Mask held this title and made it prestigious within Japan's junior heavyweight division. For the vast majority of American wrestling fans, this title didn't exist. It was technically a WWF championship, but functionally a New Japan championship. This weird arrangement continued until 1985, when Vince and New Japan ended their working relationship. And just like that, the Junior Heavyweight Championship was deactivated for the second and final time. New Japan moved on and created their own Junior Heavyweight title in 1986, and Vince pretended the title never existed. But speaking of Junior Heavyweight titles, let's jump forward a couple decades to talk about a championship that actually had potential. The Cruiserweight Championship, and I'm talking about the original version from the early to mid-2000s, not the purple disaster that came later, was introduced after WWE bought WCW in 2001. WCW's Cruiserweight division had been one of the few bright spots in that company's dying years, so WWE decided to keep the title and the division alive under their banner. But the problem started almost immediately. Vince never truly understood what made WCW's Cruiserweight division special. In WCW, these smaller wrestlers were given time to have amazing matches that opened shows and got crowds invested. In WWE, cruiserweights were treated like a sideshow attraction, given 5-minute matches on Sunday Night Heat or used as comedy fodder. The championship itself looked pretty good, but a good-looking belt can't save a division that's being actively buried by the company. Wrestlers like Rey Mysterio, Tajiri, and Paul London did everything they could to make the title meaningful, and by 2007, the writing was on the wall. On September 28, 2007, Hornswoggle was stripped of the Cruiserweight title, and the Cruiserweight division's final champion was a comedy character who wasn't even really a wrestler. The original Cruiserweight Championship is now barely remembered, overshadowed by the purple belt that would come years later. But if you want to talk about wasting potential with a championship belt, we need to discuss the strangest and shortest-lived version of an existing title. In 2003, Vince reactivated the US title, and the title actually looked gorgeous. While many wrestlers like Rusev, JBL, and MVP would go on to hold this version of the championship, many fans don't know that John Cena had a custom spinner version of this title when he was champion. Cena held this modified belt for a very short period during his early rise, but even the company seemed to realize immediately that this was a mistake and reverted back to the previous version after Cena lost the title. But after dropping the belt, Cena would go on to become WWE champion and dominate the company for the majority of 2005 to 2010. For every successful second and third generation star in the WWE like Randy Orton and Cody Rhodes, there are dozens who failed to live up to their family legacy. From The Rock's daughter to Ric Flair's son, from failed members of the bloodline to third-generation stars landing in prison, these are the biggest failed products of nepotism in WWE history. Kicking things off with arguably the most high-profile recent example, the daughter of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Ava Raine. Ava came from the richest bloodline in wrestling history. The Rock is arguably the biggest crossover star pro wrestling has ever produced. His father, Rocky Johnson, was part of one of the most legendary tag teams in WWE history. His grandfather was a legendary figure in Hawaii and the Pacific. And through her bloodline, Ava is related to Roman Reigns, the Usos, Solo Sikoa, Umaga, basically half the Samoan dynasty. She signed with WWE in 2020 and debuted on NXT in late 2022 as Ava Raine, the fourth member of Joe Gacy's faction. She was positioned as a manager and occasional in-ring competitor. She wrestled a grand total of 4 matches, and her most notable singles match was a loss to Ivy Nile at NXT Heatwave in 2023. That was essentially the end of her in-ring story. It was clear that she didn't have the athletic ability or the charisma that her father possessed. After that, WWE pivoted her to an authority figure role. By the end of 2023, she was Shawn Michaels' assistant, and by 2024, she was named the general manager of NXT. Throughout her run as NXT GM, fans and journalists criticized her for her dry personality and polarizing political opinions that they thought didn't belong in the wrestling world. But here's where it gets interesting. In January 2026, Ava announced she would not be renewing her contract, ending a 6-year run with the company. In 6 years, the daughter of the most electrifying man in sports entertainment never had a single meaningful in-ring victory. She went from developmental talent to management figure so fast that nobody ever got the chance to find out if she could actually wrestle. Whether the door revolves back to wrestling or she moves on entirely, her WWE chapter feels like a draft that never became a finished story. But speaking of finishing stories, let's talk about a guy whose story had a genuinely dark ending that nobody saw coming. Ted Jr. came from wrestling royalty. His grandfather was a legit tough guy in the territorial era. His father, the $1 Million Man, was one of the greatest heels in wrestling history. The family name alone carried enormous weight. Ted signed with WWE in 2007 and came up through Florida Championship Wrestling. His debut on Raw in May 2008 was a statement. Within weeks, he was already a tag team champion alongside Cody Rhodes, and also sharing the ring with big names like John Cena and Batista. WWE even cast him in The Marine 2, which tells you exactly how much they believed in him as a future face of the company. Then he joined The Legacy alongside Randy Orton and Cody Rhodes, and it looks like everything was on track. The faction became a key part of Monday Night Raw in 2009 and feuded with high-profile names such as Triple H and Shawn Michaels. The problem was that when Legacy dissolved, Ted Jr. didn't have the intangible factor to carry himself as a singles star. His father's $1 Million Man gimmick was handed to him, including bringing back the actual $1 Million Championship and hiring Virgil as a bodyguard. But it went nowhere. He bounced around the midcard, partnered with Mrs. Wife, had some brief feuds over the US title, got lost, and quietly let his contract expire in September 2013, later revealing that mental health issues played a major role in his decision to walk away from a 5-year extension. After this, he essentially retired from wrestling. For a while, it seemed like Ted Jr. had decided to live a modest life, working a modest job away from the limelight. But then, in 2022, his story took a genuinely shocking turn. Ted Jr., his father, and his brother Brett were sued by the Mississippi Department of Human Services for allegedly misusing over $20 million from a welfare fund. In 2023, Ted Jr. was federally indicted on charges including conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering. However, most fans forget that Ted wasn't the only member of Legacy who failed. And while Ted Jr. at least had a legit run in wrestling, the next guy on our list barely got a cup of coffee before WWE showed him the door. Alongside Cody Rhodes and Ted Jr., Manu was a member of the OG Legacy faction. His father, Afa, is one half of the Wild Samoans, one of the most influential tag teams in WWE history. The family tree includes The Rock, Roman Reigns, The Usos, Yokozuna, Umaga, Rikishi. The list goes on. Alpha Jr. debuted as a teenager in 1998 and spent years on the independent circuit before getting a developmental deal with WWE in 2006. He went through Deep South Wrestling and Florida Championship Wrestling, even winning the FCW Southern Heavyweight Championship. By September 2008, he was on the main roster under the name Manu, aligned with Cody Rhodes and Ted Jr., with Randy Orton circling the group as a mentor figure. The plan was to have all three young multi-generational stars graduate into the legacy. But backstage, opinions of Manu soured quickly. He was criticized internally for his physical conditioning and told by Jim Ross in a public blog at the time that he needed to lose weight. Reports later surfaced that Orton himself felt Manu hadn't paid his dues and had a poor attitude backstage. On February 23, 2009, barely 5 months into his main roster run, Manu was released. Since then, he's spent years bouncing around regional promotions on the indie circuit. He and his brother L.A. Smooth had multiple tag title reigns in World Wrestling Council. As of January 2026, he's still active on the indie scene, but Manu's WWE window opened and closed in the span of a single season. Going from a guy who had the bloodline but couldn't get traction, let's talk about someone who was handed everything and still failed. Ric Flair is arguably one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. 16 world championships, legendary matches, iconic factions. In terms of in-ring charisma, promo ability, and long-term consistency, Ric Flair set the standard that everyone else chases. Unfortunately, his son David had absolutely none of it. And to be fair to David, he never really wanted any of it. By his own admission and by what Ric Flair wrote in his autobiography, David's childhood dream was to become a state trooper, not a wrestler. But WCW was dying in 1998 and desperate for anything that could generate attention, so they put Ric Flair's kid on television with barely any training and just hoped the name would do the work. David debuted in a tag match alongside his father at WCW Sold Out in January 1999. Within months, WCW had made him the youngest United States champion in company history. Not because he earned it, but because Ric Flair, as on-screen WCW president, just handed it to him. He won matches with help from Arn Anderson. He got carried by better wrestlers wherever he went, and his run with Crowbar and Daphne in 2000 was probably his most tolerable stretch because the faction's chaos hid how green he was. When WCW folded in 2001, WWE picked up his contract and sent him to Ohio Valley Wrestling. He spent about 18 months there, made 2 brief appearances on WWE television, both of which involved The Undertaker roughing him up as part of a feud with his father, and was quietly released in late 2002. He had a short TNA run in late 2002 and early 2003, joined Vince Russo's faction briefly, and then drifted through the independent circuit before wrestling his last match in 2008. Today, David Flair works as a manager at a copper and steel wire company in North Carolina. He's married with 2 kids. By all accounts, he's happy. And honestly, given how badly his wrestling career went for someone who didn't really want to be there in the first place, that might be the best outcome he could have hoped for. The lesson of David Flair isn't that nepotism failed him. It's that nepotism pushed him into an industry he was never built for, and the results were painful to watch. But while David Flair at least tasted championship gold in a major promotion like WCW, the next person on our list had all the tools to become wrestling's biggest female star, but burned every bridge she crossed. Tessa Blanchard comes from one of wrestling's most legendary families. Her grandfather, Joe Blanchard, founded Southwest Championship Wrestling in Texas in the 1960s. Her father, Tully Blanchard, was one of the Four Horsemen, one of the most prestigious factions in wrestling history. Tessa trained at High Spots Wrestling School at age 18, kept her plans secret from her family at first, and grinded the independent scene for years before anyone handed her anything. That part of her story is genuinely impressive. She tried out for WWE in 2014 but didn't get signed. She competed in the Mae Young Classic in 2017, had solid showings, but again, no major WWE deal materialized. Instead of sulking, she went to Impact Wrestling and made herself a star. Her peak came in 2020 when she defeated Sami Callihan to become the first woman in history to win a Men's World Heavyweight Championship in TNA. It was a legit, once-in-a-generation moment that could have been the beginning of her rise as wrestling's next biggest female star. Instead, it all fell apart. When the pandemic hit, Tessa reportedly no-showed Impact events and failed to send in promotional content they needed during the lockdown period. Impact stripped her of the title and terminated her contract. Around the same time, accusations of past bullying behavior toward fellow wrestlers surfaced on social media. The reports were damning enough that both AEW and WWE wanted nothing to do with her. She went from being the hottest free agent in women's wrestling to essentially being blacklisted in the span of weeks. She spent 2 years largely away from the business, resurfaced in CMLL in Mexico, and made her shocking return to TNA at Final Resolution in December 2024. As of January 2026, she's active in TNA's Knockouts division, trying to rebuild her reputation. Whether the redemption arc sticks or if she ends up blowing it will decide the next chapter of her wrestling career. But while Tessa's fall was largely self-inflicted, let's talk about a guy whose father's shadow was too perfect to escape. Curtis Axel had a serious lineage to live up to. His grandfather, Larry the Axe Hennig, was a territory-era powerhouse. His father, Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig, was one of the most well-known performers in wrestling history. Joe Hennig signed with WWE in 2007 and went through Florida Championship Wrestling. He debuted on the main roster in 2010 under the name Michael McGillicuddy, notably stripping away his famous surname, seemingly determined to make it on his own merit. The idea was admirable, but the execution was flat. Without the name and without a character, he was invisible. He bounced between mid-card obscurity and NXT for 3 years, racking up losing streak after losing streak. Then, in 2013, Vince rebooted him as Curtis Axel, combining his father's first name and his grandfather's nickname, and gave him Paul Heyman as a mouthpiece. And suddenly, Axel looked like a star. He beat Triple H and John Cena in the same week through cheap finishes and won the Intercontinental Championship at Payback, becoming the first father-son duo to both hold that title. It felt like the beginning of something special. But then WWE completely dropped the ball. Axel lost the title within months, drifted through forgettable tag partnerships with Ryback, Heath Slater, and Bo Dallas. He became a meme through Axelmania and spent the back half of his tenure as a jobber. He was released in April 2020, came back briefly as a producer in 2022 for 3 months, and that was it. 13 years in the WWE, 1 IC title reign, and a legacy he couldn't live up to. But going from a guy who couldn't get out of the undercard, let's talk about someone who never even got the chance to find out what he could have been. Richie Steamboat was, in many ways, the perfect wrestling prospect on paper. His father, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, is widely considered one of the greatest workers in the history of professional wrestling. Richie appeared ringside with his father at WrestleMania 4 as a toddler. He was a 4-time state champion and 2-time national champion in amateur wrestling. He trained under Harley Race. He toured Europe. He was signed by WWE in December 2009, went through Florida Championship Wrestling, and started winning titles. He won the FCW Tag Team Championship alongside Seth Rollins. He won the FCW Heavyweight Championship. And when FCW became NXT in 2012, Richie was one of the guys the brand was built around. He had a strong feud with Cassius Ohno and looked like a main roster call-up was waiting to happen. But then in November 2012, during a match on NXT, everything crumbled when he landed wrong on a moonsault. He lost feeling in his entire body from his chin down in an instant. The feeling gradually returned, but he'd herniated 3 discs and bruised his spinal cord. Doctors told him he should have been paralyzed. He wrestled through it for 6 months without telling many people, quietly managing one of the most serious spinal injuries in wrestling history, before finally sitting down and facing the reality. He couldn't even pick up his young son without pain. He was released in December 2013 and never wrestled again. He's now a stay-at-home father to 4 kids while his wife runs her own law firm. The tragedy isn't that he failed, it's that a back injury on a moonsault ended what might have been one of the more remarkable careers of his generation. But while Richie's story is genuinely heartbreaking, the next entry on our list is even more tragic. For decades, Jerry Lawler was the biggest wrestling star in the Mid-South region, drawing huge crowds in the territories, dominating the USWA, and eventually becoming the second most familiar voice in wrestling history alongside Jim Ross. In Memphis, he wasn't just a wrestler, he was a cultural icon. His son Brian Christopher grew up with that weight on his shoulders. He debuted in the USWA in the late 1980s and racked up 44 championships in the family promotion over the years. He was a legitimate star in Memphis before WWE ever called. When he arrived in WWE in 1997, he began teaming with Scott Taylor in a team called Too Much. In 1999, they became Too Cool, added Rikishi to the act, and the whole thing took off. Dancing, flashy outfits, genuinely over babyfaces during the Attitude Era. They captured the tag team titles from Edge and Christian in May 2000, and it was the peak of his wrestling career. Then, in 2001, Lawler was caught transporting illegal substances across the US-Canadian border and was released by WWE. He floated between independent promotions for the better part of the next decade and a half, with occasional nostalgia appearances, including a 2014 Raw reunion with Scotty 2 Hotty and Rikishi. But outside the ring, life was getting progressively harder. In July 2018, Lawler was arrested in Tennessee on DUI charges and placed in Hardeman County Jail. On July 29, 2018, corrections officers found him unresponsive in his cell, and he passed away at 46 years old. Jerry Lawler filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the county in 2019, but the case was eventually dismissed in September 2024. Brian Christopher never became the generational star that his father was. Instead, his story ended up becoming one of the darkest tales in wrestling history. From comedic chaos
I saw it in your eyes
to emotional moments,
my real name is Joe, and I've been living with leukemia for 11 years.
These are times when WWE wrestlers broke character in front of the world, starting with Sami Zayn cracking up the entire bloodline.
I'm doing a little dance.
Hello. Doing the two-step, right?
That's, I'm in his head doing the dance.
Part of Sheamus's body and such a toll over the past.
Back in 2022, the Bloodline was the most dominant and serious faction WWE had seen in years. But then came Sami Zayn, and everything changed. On an episode of SmackDown, tensions exploded between Jay and Sami, and Roman Reigns had to step in like a disappointed dad. But when Sami grabbed the microphone, the entire segment fell apart.
Hasn't been very oozy.
Roman tried to keep his composure, and Jay had to put his head in his hands to hide his laughter. But that wasn't the only time Sami broke the bloodline. Earlier that year, Sami told the Usos he could get into Drew McIntyre's head by laying out a picnic and doing a little dance.
So dance you
That's, I'm in his head doing the dance. Yeah.
I'll tell you all about it later. Okay?
Yeet. All right.
Stay right here. Stay right.
Jay immediately covered his mouth, trying desperately not to laugh. Then there was the time Sami called Logan Paul the
Giant number 2.
causing both Logan and Roman to break character and smile at each other. Sami's infectious personality showed a completely different side of the bloodline and gave fans some of the most entertaining television WWE produced that year.
Waffle House. You right?
He just hasn't been
Like, where's my dog? Where's my dog?
very oozy.
My dog. I'm right here.
That's my dog. That is my goose.
But if there's one superstar who has a supernatural ability to make people laugh, it's R-Truth. The man doesn't even try. He just exists in his own confused reality, and everyone around him can't help but break into laughter.
What are you doing out here? You're not even in the match. I'm not. You sure?
I am so proud of you. You know, we got a lot of history. You know what I'm saying? Is this your son, dog?
But R-Truth's most legendary moment came on the January 13th, 2020 episode of Raw when he did the impossible and made Brock Lesnar laugh.
You will go flying, Paul Heyman.
I'm not in the Royal Rumble.
But Brock wasn't the only person Truth broke. During his time with the Judgment Day, Truth drove Damian Priest absolutely crazy.
Saw it in your eyes. We've been through a lot together. Money in the Bank, the Women's Royal Rumble, the Judgment Day in your house. We a real family now.
Priest later admitted that Triple H called him out for having a horrible poker face. But karma came swiftly, because not long after, R-Truth made Triple H break on television too by confusing him for Tommaso Ciampa.
You a crafty little genie, huh? Tommaso Ciampa.
But not every character break is funny. Sometimes wrestlers drop the act because something has gone terribly wrong. On an episode of Raw in 2016, Chris Jericho faced Neville in what should have been a standard match. But midway through the bout, Neville went for a Frankensteiner, and that's when everything went south. After taking the bump, Neville told Jericho that he had broken his ankle. Suddenly, the veteran Jericho had to think on his feet. Referee Charles Robinson didn't fully understand what was happening, so Jericho tried to end the match subtly by rolling up Neville. Unfortunately, Robinson only counted to 2. So Jericho did something brilliant. He deliberately got himself disqualified. He shoved Robinson multiple times, and while he was arguing with the referee, the cameras stayed focused on them instead of the injured Neville. It was a masterclass in ring awareness and protecting your opponent, even if it meant breaking character to do it. But while Jericho saved an injured opponent, Michael Cole saved his partner's life. September 10th, 2012 was supposed to be Pat Patterson Appreciation Night. Instead, it became one of the most terrifying nights in WWE history. During a tag team match between the Primetime Players and Team Hell No, something went horribly wrong with Jerry Lawler. Cole was focused on his monitor, calling the action, when he heard what sounded like snoring. For a split second, Cole thought Lawler was doing a bit, but then Cole looked over and saw Jerry's head slumped on the table, his arms starting to shake. Panic set in immediately. Cole hit the mute switch and started screaming for WWE's doctor, who rushed over to find Lawler in full cardiac arrest. The King was having a massive heart attack on live television. Medical staff swarmed the announce table while the match continued in the ring. When Raw came back from commercials, Michael Cole, who at the time was playing a heel character and had been feuding with Lawler for over a year, completely broke character. With tears in his eyes, Cole addressed the situation. When Lawler returned to Raw months later, he was met with a hero's welcome, and the incident had inadvertently turned Michael Cole from the most hated heel commentator into someone fans could finally respect. But 4 years after Lawler's heart attack, WWE experienced another sobering reality check when Roman Reigns stepped into the ring on an episode of Raw in 2018. The big dog had been on top of the wrestling world, main eventing WrestleManias and holding the Universal Championship. But when his music hit that night, something felt different.
My real name is Joe.
When he grabbed the microphone, Reigns broke character and disclosed that his leukemia was back.
And unfortunately, it's back.
The arena went silent. This wasn't a storyline. The man behind Roman Reigns was revealing that his cancer had returned and he had to relinquish the Universal Championship and step away from WWE to fight for his life. The announcement hit the wrestling world like a freight train. Fans who had booed Roman for years suddenly realized they'd been watching a real person battling a life-threatening illness while performing at the highest level. Backstage, wrestlers from both Raw and SmackDown were emotional. His Shield brothers came out on the stage, and Rollins broke down in tears on live TV. Thankfully, Roman's story has a happy ending. He returned to WWE in February 2019, announced his leukemia was in remission, and eventually became the Tribal Chief, embarking on one of the greatest championship reigns in WWE history. But Reigns' announcement wasn't the only time Seth Rollins broke character. WrestleMania 40 was supposed to be Seth Rollins' moment to shine. But when Night 2 kicked off in Philadelphia, Rollins walked into the match at a severe disadvantage. The night before, he'd taken a brutal beating, and his injured knee was barely holding together. Despite Rollins' valiant effort, Drew hit multiple devastating Claymore kicks and captured the World Heavyweight Championship. But what happened after the match is what made everyone emotional. As Drew sat in the ring clutching the title, Rollins, who was clearly heartbroken and in tears, locked eyes with McIntyre and completely broke character to show genuine respect for his opponent finally achieving his dream.
This title into prominence. He's the man.
Of course, Drew's celebration was short-lived, but that emotional exchange between two warriors was the perfect way to kick off Night 2 of Mania. Switching gears from emotional moments, let's turn our attention back to comedy. During his WWE tenure from 2007 to 2014, Santino Marella had one very specific goal, and that was to make everyone laugh.
See, KYJ.
Hamburger, rotten burger.
It can be called McDonald's.
Manimal, Baptista.
Everyone from John Cena to Rey Mysterio to even Vince McMahon himself struggled to keep a straight face when Santino was on screen. From his tea party with Sheamus and Vladimir Kozlov to his legendary Santino Marella alter ego, Santino proved that sometimes the best moments in wrestling happen when performers can't keep a straight face.
Look at me, huh? I'm a Baptista. Big mouth, John Cena. John Cena, you people have shown me nothing but misrespect.
Man who hides behind a mask, either incredibly ugly or is the Batman.
The Undertaker is perhaps the most iconic character in WWE history, and for 3 decades, Mark Calloway protected that character's aura with incredible discipline. Taker rarely broke kayfabe, rarely appeared out of character, and maintained an almost supernatural mystique. So when a video surfaced of the dead man completely losing his mind at a house show in Vienna, Austria, fans couldn't believe their eyes. The match was a handicap bout, and everything seemed normal until Taker was waiting for the hot tag on the apron. Suddenly, the Phenom poured water on himself and started sprinting back and forth along the ring apron like a man possessed. The crowd went absolutely crazy because nobody had ever seen The Undertaker like this. Years later, on his 6 Feet Under podcast, Taker finally explained what was happening. First, he forgot that even at house shows in 2009, everyone had cell phones. Second, and more importantly, he was teaching Cody and Ted the importance of a hot tag. But even the most experienced wrestlers have bad nights, and for Randy Orton, one of those nights came on Monday Night Raw in 2013. The Viper had been in WWE for over a decade by this point and had cut thousands of promos, so nobody expected what happened next. Randy and Sheamus were in the ring, both demanding a match against Big Show after the Giant had attacked them at WrestleMania 29. Randy started his promo strong, but then, mid-sentence, the wheels completely fell off. Randy turned completely blank, then turned to Sheamus, and you could actually see him asking the Celtic Warrior what his next line was supposed to be. But while this moment slightly reduced the Viper's aura, what he did at Survivor Series 2016 immediately gave him plus 1,000 aura points. Survivor Series 2016 was brutal for Shane McMahon. Roman Reigns caught Shane in midair during his coast-to-coast attempt and drove him hard into the mat. The spot looked incredible, but Shane landed wrong and was clearly hurt. Medical staff immediately checked on him, and he had to be removed from the match. Shane's wife and children were sitting in the front row, watching their father get injured on live TV. Shane's young son was visibly upset, seeing his dad being attended to by doctors and not getting up. That's when Randy Orton, still in the middle of the match, completely broke character in one of the most wholesome moments in WWE history. Between spots in the match, Randy walked over to where Shane's family was sitting and leaned over the barricade to comfort them. He made sure Shane's son knew that his dad was going to be okay, that it was part of the show, and that Shane was tough enough to handle it. Randy knew what it was like to grow up in the wrestling business, and he wasn't going to let a kid worry about his dad. Team SmackDown ended up winning the match, but the real victory that night was Randy showing that beneath the Viper's cold exterior, there's a human being with a huge heart. June 2007 should have been one of WWE's most talked about storylines. Vince McMahon's character had just died in a limousine explosion on the June 11th episode of Raw, and WWE had planned an entire angle around the incident. The next scheduled Raw was supposed to feature Mr. McMahon's funeral, complete with a coffin and everything, but reality had other plans. On June 25th, 2007, WWE received devastating news that would change everything. Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their 7-year-old son Daniel had been found dead at their home in Georgia. The funeral angle was scrapped instantly. Instead, WWE aired a 3-hour tribute show celebrating Benoit's career. But as the tribute show aired, the horrifying truth began to emerge. Reports started surfacing that Benoit had murdered his family before taking his own life. By the time the show ended, Vince and everyone watching realized they had just spent 3 hours honoring a man who had committed an unspeakable crime. The next night on ECW, Vince McMahon had to appear on camera and address the situation, completely abandoning his limo storyline and erasing Benoit from history. It was one of the few times in Vince's career where he admitted he didn't know what to do. WrestleMania 28's end-of-an-era match between The Undertaker and Triple H was the final chapter of a story that spanned 4 WrestleManias. After the match, all 3 legends slowly made their way up the ramp together. Arms around each other's shoulders, they turned to face the 70,000 fans in Miami's Sun Life Stadium and embraced. But the most emotional moment happened backstage. Vince McMahon was waiting for The Undertaker, and when Taker walked through the curtain, the two shared a tearful embrace.
He's an incredible man.
Vince knew what the dead man had just sacrificed for that match. The Undertaker was so physically broken that he could barely walk. The entire experience, from the in-ring war to the emotional aftermath, represented everything beautiful about professional wrestling. These weren't just characters anymore. They were brothers, legends, and men who had given their bodies and souls to this business.
Important person in my life.
On December 13th, 2025, John Cena walked to the ring at Saturday night's main event in Washington, D.C. for the final time as an active wrestler. After 23 years, 17 world championships, and countless WrestleMania main events, the man who had been WWE's face for over a decade was saying goodbye. His opponent was Gunther, and for 23 minutes, Cena and the ring general put on a solid match. But in a moment that shocked everyone, Cena tapped out to Gunther's sleeper hold. The crowd sat in stunned silence. This wasn't the fairy tale ending anyone expected. As Cena sat in the ring processing his final defeat, the entire WWE roster came out. CM Punk and Cody Rhodes walked down and draped their championship belts over Cena's shoulders. Triple H pointed to the screen as a tribute video played. When the video ended, Cena removed his shoes and his sweatbands, carefully placing them in the center of the ring. He walked up the ramp, surrounded by the entire locker room, giving one final salute to the fans before disappearing through the curtain. Even after the broadcast ended, Cody Rhodes stayed near the ring alone, soaking in the final moments. Whether you loved Cena or hated him, you can't deny his impact on WWE's history.
Look at me! Look at me! Look at me!
The disrespect that you have even talking to me.
Does that feel fake?
You want to act like you're hot.
From being asked if wrestling is fake to steroid accusations and personal attacks, these are the times WWE wrestlers lost their cool and shut down disrespectful interviewers. Starting with the time CM Punk dropped the pipe bomb on an interviewer. Back in December 2014, CM Punk had walked away from professional wrestling and shocked the world by signing with the UFC. He was attempting to reinvent himself as a legit mixed martial artist, and when TSN's Michael Landsberg sat down with Punk for Off the Record, it seemed like a straightforward promotional interview. But what started as a casual discussion about Punk's UFC journey quickly deteriorated into one of the most uncomfortable interviews in history. Landsberg peppered Punk with questions that felt more suited for a comedy roast than a serious interview. He suggested Punk's first UFC opponent should be Drake or Justin Bieber, treating his whole UFC career transition like a joke. But Landsberg's biggest mistake wasn't the jokes. It was his inability to let WWE stay in the past. Despite Punk making it clear he wanted to focus on his UFC future, Landsberg kept circling back to WWE storylines, backstage politics, and wrestling controversies. And then came the moment when Punk finally snapped.
Your demeanor off the camera is 100% different than you want to act like you're hot.
No,
I like your gimmick, kid.
Punk, who had been keeping his composure despite the provocations, called out Landsberg for being two-faced. He accused the journalist of acting friendly and supportive off-camera, only to change his whole demeanor the moment the recording light turned on. Landsberg attempted damage control, but Punk cut through the diplomatic response immediately and told Landsberg that he likes his gimmick. The word choice was deliberate. By calling Landsberg's journalistic persona a gimmick, Punk flipped the entire dynamic. Suddenly, it wasn't the wrestler playing a character. It was the reporter. The interview limped to an awkward conclusion, but Landsberg had already learned exactly why you don't mess with Punk when he has a live mic. But if Punk's takedown of Landsberg was calculated, Randy Orton's response to disrespect was far more direct and physical. Randy Orton has built a Hall of Fame career on his ability to switch from calm and collected to explosively violent in the blink of an eye. It's what made the Viper one of the most dangerous characters in WWE history. But in June 2009, a Mexican TV reporter discovered that Orton's volatile nature wasn't just limited to the ring. Orton was in Mexico City as part of WWE's promotional tour, doing the standard media rounds to hype upcoming shows. The interview started normally, but the reporter seemed determined to get under Orton's skin. He asked silly questions like what Orton ate for breakfast, and Orton's patience was already wearing thin when the reporter made a critical mistake. He used the word fragile to describe Orton and asked why he got injured so often. For a wrestler whose entire brand is built on being a calculated, dangerous athlete, being called fragile is perhaps the worst possible insult. It attacks not just the character, but the person behind it. Someone who had worked through countless injuries and maintained an elite position in the industry for years. Orton's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. He grabbed the mic from the reporter's hand and got right in his face. Orton dared the reporter to call him fragile to his face and threatened to headbutt his teeth through his skull if he tried to be funny again.
I will headbutt your teeth through your skull!
The incident sparked immediate debate among wrestling fans. Some argued Orton had genuinely lost his temper. Others believed it was a masterful bit of Orton staying in character as the Viper. Whether Orton was truly angry or simply refused to break character, the message was clear. Treat professional wrestlers with respect or face the consequences. But while Orton's confrontation was intense and personal, it paled in comparison to what happened when one of wrestling's most beloved rebels decided to defend the sport in front of the whole world. Roddy Piper spent his entire career breaking rules and speaking uncomfortable truths. As one of wrestling's greatest talkers, he could verbally destroy opponents on the mic before physically outperforming them in the ring. So when comedian Bill Maher decided to mock professional wrestling on his ABC show Politically Incorrect, he had no idea that he was about to get educated by the legend. In 1999, Maher invited Piper, Sting, Bobby Heenan, and Medusa onto his show. But from the moment the segment began, it was clear Maher had no intention of treating his guests or their profession with any semblance of respect.
And they are in on the joke.
Maher opened with a condescending statement that everyone knows wrestling is fake and the audience is in on the joke. Sting attempted to defend the business diplomatically, pointing out that while outcomes were predetermined, the physical toll was absolutely real. But Maher, playing to his audience and his own sense of intellectual superiority, wasn't buying it. He laughed it off and said that there's never a bruise on any of the wrestlers, trying to downplay the physicality of professional wrestling. And that's when Piper decided he'd heard enough. Without warning, Hot Rod stood up from his seat, revealing a metal hip. He then pointed to his wrist and told everyone that it had been broken for 7 years.
Metal hip. Broken wrist.
The studio audience, which had been laughing along with Maher's mockery just moments before, was now cheering for Hot Rod. But this wasn't entertainment anymore. This was real pain, real sacrifice, and real consequences being displayed on national TV. However, Piper wasn't finished delivering his message. He was yet to drop the bombshell. He invoked Owen Hart's name and told Maher to go ask Owen's widow Martha if wrestling was fake.
Go tell Mrs. Hart what a joke it is.
Maher had been treating wrestling like a carnival sideshow, but Piper had just reminded everyone that men had died doing this job. Fathers had left behind families. Brothers had been buried. This wasn't fake. The finishes might be predetermined, but the wheelchairs, the surgeries, the funerals, those were heartbreakingly real. The host, visibly uncomfortable now, tried to recover with more jokes, but his audience wasn't laughing anymore. Piper had exposed the fundamental cruelty of dismissing something millions of people dedicated their lives to, something that had cost men their health and even their lives. Piper hadn't just defended professional wrestling, he'd educated the entire world about the difference between scripted outcomes and the physical sacrifice wrestlers have to make. He'd transformed a segment designed to mock into a moment of respect. But while Piper's confrontation became legendary, our next incident would take place on foreign soil, where one wrestler's defense of the business almost landed him in prison. In 1997, WWE was expanding its international reach to places like Europe and the Middle East. The Undertaker and Vader were sent to Kuwait as part of the promotional tour for an upcoming WWE event in the region. They appeared on Good Morning Kuwait, a popular talk show for what was supposed to be a standard promotional appearance. Everything proceeded normally until the host asked the forbidden question of if wrestling is real or if wrestlers are just acting. The Undertaker, trying to keep his cool, handled the question diplomatically. He explained that while storylines were predetermined, the physicality was absolutely real. But Vader was in no mood to be diplomatic. Without warning, he flipped the interview table. The host's eyes went wide with shock as Vader lunged forward, grabbed him by his necktie, and pulled the terrified host toward him. Vader asked the host if that felt fake as the cameras captured everything. This wasn't a casual morning talk show anymore. This was a 450-pound former super heavyweight champion attacking a television personality on live television. The aftermath was swift and severe. Kuwaiti authorities detained Vader almost immediately after the incident. He was charged with assault and using obscene language on live TV. Rather than being put in a standard jail cell, Vader was placed under house arrest in a hotel for approximately 10 days while authorities decided what to do with him. Eventually, Vader was fined and allowed to leave the country. But the story had already become global news. Critics pointed out that Vader had massively overreacted to the question, while defenders argued that Vader was simply protecting kayfabe. But while Vader's confrontation happened in the 1990s, our next incident would unfold in the age of social media, where a wrestler's defense of his craft could go viral in minutes. By 2024, professional wrestling had been around for over a century. Every conceivable question had been asked and every cheap joke had been made at wrestlers' expense. You'd think mainstream media would have learned how to treat wrestling with basic professional respect. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. When WWE announced that Elimination Chamber 2024 would take place in Perth, Australia, it represented a major moment for the company's international expansion. Grayson Waller and Knight appeared on one of Australia's most popular morning shows for what seemed like a simple promotional interview. But then, the hosts made a mistake. Barr suggested that Waller and Knight demonstrate some of their wrestling moves, treating it like a fun morning show bit instead of a legit sports. But Waller wasn't smiling anymore. Before he could fully articulate why this was problematic, the floor manager approached Waller and began shadowboxing as if this were all some kind of joke. Waller's expression hardened, and he declared that if he came over there and punched him in the jaw, they'd have to call the police. The hosts quickly tried to move on, clearly realizing the interview had gone completely off the rails. But the damage was done, and more importantly, the cameras had captured everything. The clip exploded across social media, and the wrestling community rallied behind Waller almost unanimously. Waller later addressed the incident in follow-up interviews, stating that he hates when people disrespect wrestling and treat it as a joke. But while Waller had control over his temper, the same can't be said about Vince McMahon. If you're going to pick a fight with Vince McMahon, you'd better come prepared. Bob Costas learned this lesson the hard way when he sat down with the WWE chairman for a 2001 interview on HBO's On the Record. The interview took place during one of the most turbulent periods in McMahon's career. His football league, the XFL, had just collapsed spectacularly after a single season. The league, which was supposed to revolutionize professional football with WWE-style entertainment, had become a national joke. Ratings had plummeted, television partners had bailed, and McMahon had lost an estimated $35 million on the venture. Costas smelled blood in the water and decided to poke the bear. He opened the interview by hammering McMahon about the XFL's failure, asking pointed questions designed to make the WWE chairman squirm. But Vince didn't get to where he was by dodging confrontation. He'd faced worse criticism than a sports journalist's disapproval and handled the questions while keeping his composure. But then Costas escalated. He began attacking the WWF itself, criticizing its violent content. He brought up the company's depiction of women, the edgy gestures made by factions like DX that had become signatures during the Attitude Era, and the fact that children were attending these shows. McMahon defended his product, arguing that it reflected contemporary culture and gave audiences what they wanted. But Costas wasn't interested in McMahon's justifications. He kept interrupting, talking over McMahon, refusing to let him complete a thought. And that's when Vince's legendary temper began to show. Vince pointed at Costas and asked him if he was going to ever let him finish or if he was going to continue interrupting him every time. The power dynamic in the room shifted immediately. Costas, who stood maybe 5 feet 7 inches and weighed around 140 pounds, was suddenly face-to-face with a 230-pound maniac who looked genuinely ready to turn the interview into a physical confrontation. Years later, McMahon admitted he was close to punching Costas during the interview, but told himself to keep his cool. The confrontation showed that McMahon viewed attacks on WWE as personal attacks on himself. The company wasn't just his business, it was his identity, his legacy, his life's work. When someone like Costas dismissed it as cheap and low quality, they weren't just criticizing a television show, they were dismissing the empire Vince McMahon had built. From attacking wrestlers on live TV to stalking and inappropriately touching them, these are WWE fans who went too far, starting with the night that gave Bret Hart Montreal flashbacks. The Hall of Fame is supposed to be a night of celebration, but somebody didn't get that memo. While Bret Hart was mid-speech, a random guy from the crowd ran up and tackled him. Security and a few wrestlers swarmed in almost instantly and dragged the attacker away. The whole thing was over in under a minute, but it was enough to remind everyone that even a feel-good tribute show isn't completely safe from chaos. The attacker had a prior criminal record, including arrests for stalking an MMA fighter and violating protective orders. He was jailed for 4 days before being released on a $1,500 bond. Randy Orton has had his fair share of weird fan interactions. During a house show in South Africa, Randy was doing his signature pose on the turnbuckle when a fan climbed into the ring and delivered a very unwelcome low blow to the Viper. Orton spun around looking for blood, but security beat him to the punch. He still got a kick in that left the guy with a black eye, which was well-deserved if you ask me. The fan had been training to be a wrestler since age 16 and continued pursuing wrestling in South Africa until a 2018 shoulder injury ended his career. But while Randy's fan interaction was unpleasant, this next incident was rather hilarious. Back in 2015, Dean Ambrose and Roman Reigns were stuck in a brutal 3-on-1 fight against the Wyatt family, and the numbers just weren't adding up. That's when one very dedicated fan decided enough was enough. He hopped the barricade wearing his own homemade gear, ready to even the odds like he'd been training for this exact moment his whole life. For about 3 glorious seconds, it looked like he might actually help. Then security showed up and reminded him that cosplay doesn't come with a WWE contract. The fan was hauled out of the building and later hit with 10 days in jail, which feels like a steep price. Funny enough, this wasn't even the first time a fake Shield member showed up uninvited, but this one definitely had the most legal consequences. Most fans dream about jumping in the ring to save their favorite wrestlers. This guy actually tried it and learned the hard way that WWE security doesn't care how good your costume is. Speaking of guys who got way too comfortable around the Shield, in 2021, a fan named Eliza Spencer ran in during a match and tackled Seth Rollins to the ground in front of a stunned crowd. Spencer later claimed that he met Rollins at a meet and greet in 2019 and was later scammed by someone on WhatsApp impersonating Rollins, sending about $3,000 in gift cards that were never properly reimbursed. He said wasn't even trying to hurt Rollins, he was trying to help his opponent win. Rollins initially said in interviews that Spencer should be banned for life, but later learned Spencer had mental health struggles and chose not to press charges. And it's not just Seth Rollins who attracts overly enthusiastic fans. At a non-televised show, Bray Wyatt and Roman Reigns were the main event, and one fan in the crowd happened to be holding a replica Money in the Bank briefcase. The fan threw the briefcase, and it nailed Reigns right in the head. Security tracked the guy down fast, and the same fans who talked him into it immediately turned around and started chanting for him to get tossed out. Kalisto himself found out the hard way that fans don't always show their support nicely. During a tag match on 205 Live, he ended up on the floor after a disqualification finish. And that's when some genius in the crowd decided to chuck a water bottle at his head. It actually cut his lip open, which is a wild overreaction for a guy who was just doing his job. Security tracked the bottle thrower down and got him out of the building, but Kalisto walked away with a souvenir he definitely didn't ask for. But while these fans were throwing foreign objects, this next fan got a little too handsy. Sasha Banks and Becky Lynch's rivalry took them to Clash of Champions. Their match spilled into the crowd, and the two women fought their way back toward the ring with zero officiating in sight. As Becky threw Sasha over the barricade, a fan in the front row reached out and tried to touch her backside. The internet exploded over it. Rumors swirled about a lifetime ban, and Banks said online she'd consider legal action. In the end, nothing ever got confirmed publicly, but the boss was ready to throw hands. But if you thought that was bad, this next fan took shamelessness to whole another level. In 2019, at AAA's Conquista Total event in Cancun, Scarlett Bordeaux was competing in a 6-woman match when she went for a move near the barricade. The second she got close, a ringside fan grabbed her and started running his hands over her like he'd never seen a wrestler up close before. Thankfully, her tag partner wasn't having it and yanked her right out of his grip. And while modern wrestling fans can be weird, the Attitude Era had its own breed of unhinged fans. Back in The Undertaker's Lord of Darkness days in the mid-90s, Paul Bearer had just betrayed the dead man, and one fan apparently took that storyline a little too personally. As Bearer walked toward the ring, a woman hopped the guardrail and went straight for him, trying to take him down herself. Security was nowhere to be found fast enough, so a cameraman actually had to step in and hold her off until help arrived. The whole thing lasted maybe 15 seconds, but Bearer played it cool afterward like nothing happened. The story doesn't end there, though. According to The Undertaker himself, that same woman somehow tracked down his hotel later that night and showed up knocking on his door. Security had to remove her from the property too. Wrestling storylines are supposed to stay in the ring, but apparently nobody told her that. But the dead man wasn't the only wrestler who had to deal with crazy fans during the Attitude Era. A few days before facing Stone Cold at WrestleMania 14, Shawn Michaels and his DX buddies did a little public promo to hype the show. It was supposed to be a quick little speech to create buzz and keep things hot on the road to WrestleMania, except someone in the crowd had other plans. Out of nowhere, a fan threw an actual battery and beamed Michaels right in the head. HBK stopped mid-sentence, clearly rattled, and just walked out of the promo altogether. Vince McMahon was reportedly furious about it afterward, not because of the battery itself, but because Michaels left the audience hanging. Apparently in Vince's world, getting struck by a flying piece of hardware still doesn't excuse you from finishing the show. Tough crowd. Tougher boss. Speaking of objects flying through the air, Triple H and Stone Cold Steve Austin once survived an entire 3 stages of hell match just to get attacked by a beverage. Both men were sprawled out on the mat, completely drained after beating the life out of each other, when a fan in the crowd decided that was the perfect moment to throw a beer can. It hit Austin directly in the head, and his reaction said it all. That thing actually hurt. Triple H rolled over just to check if he was okay. Security never found the guy since he was too far back, so somewhere out there is a man who got away with assaulting the Texas Rattlesnake with a Bud Light. And then there's the time a fan almost ended Eddie Guerrero's career mid-match. During the legendary ladder match between Eddie and Rob Van Dam in 2002, both men had already beaten the heck out of each other trying to reach the title hanging above the ring. Eddie was climbing back up near the top when a fan hopped the barrier, ran in, and shoved the ladder right out from under him. Eddie actually thought it was a wrestler doing a run-in at first, which honestly says a lot about how often that used to happen. Thankfully, he landed on his feet like a cat instead of breaking his neck, and the intruder was hauled out almost immediately. RVD ended up winning the match, but that fan deserves a permanent spot on the list of worst time decisions in wrestling history. And speaking of RVD, let's go back to one of the most rabid wrestling crowds of all time at ECW One Night Stand. When most fans think of this show, they think about the hostile reaction to John Cena and the ECW fans throwing his shirt back at him. However, Cena wasn't the only wrestler who got heat from the fans that night. Randy Orton walked into a building that hated him on sight, which he clearly enjoyed. Then a random kid in the crowd reached out and punched him right in the arm. Orton turned around and gave the kid the full death stare, while the kid just stood there chewing his gum like nothing happened. Somehow he never got tossed, but up next, things take a much darker turn. In 2020, Sonya Deville wasn't dealing with some guy jumping a barricade. She was dealing with an actual stalker breaking into her home. A man named Philip Thomas had been sending her disturbing messages on Instagram for years, the kind that get buried in your requests folder and never seen. He drove from South Carolina to her house in Florida, cut a hole in her patio screen, and waited there for hours before breaking in through a sliding door in the middle of the night. DeVille's alarm went off, and she came face to face with him in her own living room. She and Mandy Rose, who was staying over, managed to escape and call 911. When police showed up, Thomas had a knife, zip ties, duct tape, and mace on him. He told officers he planned to pepper spray her because he was scared of her MMA background, and somehow also claimed he knew her personally, which was completely untrue. He ended up pleading guilty and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. This one wasn't a wild ring moment, it was genuinely terrifying, and a reminder that not every fan story ends with a funny security takedown. Unfortunately, Sonya Deville isn't the only one with a story like this. In 2025, Liv Morgan found out a man had gotten through her gated community and spent 2 hours ringing her doorbell, checking under doormats for spare keys, and circling her property while she was away for work. He eventually left a strange 2-page note suggesting he believed they were already in some kind of relationship. Morgan reported it to WWE, who immediately looped in the FBI rather than treating it as a normal fan encounter. The man, identified as Sean Chan, was arrested days later when he showed up at the WWE Performance Center and security recognized him on site. Morgan said she wasn't scared looking back on it, but it's still unsettling how close it got before anyone stepped in. But after all that heaviness, here's a story that's more chaotic than scary. During CM Punk's match against Vince McMahon on Raw, Ryback and John Cena got involved trying to save Vince, and Punk ended up sprinting into the crowd to escape. Standing shoulder to shoulder with fans, a little too close for comfort apparently, Punk suddenly punched one of them right in the face. Except slow-motion replays later showed that the actual fan who smacked him on the back of the head was someone completely different, standing a few feet away. So Punk straight up clocked an innocent guy, while the real instigator walked off unharmed. Wrong place, wrong time, and an extremely unlucky face. But while this interaction was rather lighthearted, recently Punk had to intervene after a fan got too close to Bayley while the wrestlers were on the road. And even stars like Rhea Ripley and Asuka have openly talked about their encounters with weird fans at airports and house shows. So if you're a wrestling fan, please stop being weird, respect the wrestler's privacy, and keep your hands to yourself. These are the craziest WWE butterfly effects when one small change led to huge, unpredictable outcomes that changed wrestling history forever. Starting with the Day 1 incident when Roman Reigns getting quarantined led to Big E breaking his neck. On January 1st, 2022, WWE was set to kick off the new year with a stacked card. The main event would see Roman Reigns defend his Universal Championship against Brock Lesnar. However, hours before the show, news broke that Reigns had tested positive for COVID and couldn't compete. WWE had to scramble and make last-minute changes. Their solution was to add Brock Lesnar to the WWE Championship match and make it a fatal 5-way instead. Lesnar dominated the match and walked out as the new WWE Champion. Had the Tribal Chief not been quarantined, Seth Rollins might have walked into WrestleMania with the WWE title. This could have turned the Cody Rhodes return match at WrestleMania against Rollins into a world title bout. But more importantly, according to initial plans, Lesnar was supposed to dethrone Reigns at the event. Reigns' historic title reign that eventually ended at WrestleMania 40 would have come to a premature finish had the Tribal Chief not been quarantined. However, the biggest loser of this situation was none other than Big E. After losing the WWE title, Big E slipped back into the tag team scene, and during a freak accident on an episode of SmackDown, the New Day member suffered a devastating injury that ended his in-ring career. But speaking of injuries that changed careers, let's talk about how Finn Balor's injury at SummerSlam 2016 caused a chain reaction that eventually led to the formation of AEW. In August 2016, WWE was ready to launch a new era on Raw with the Universal Championship. Finn Balor became the inaugural champion after defeating Seth Rollins at SummerSlam in a fantastic match. This was supposed to be Finn's moment to shine as the new face of Monday Night Raw. However, during the match, he suffered a severe shoulder injury that would require surgery. Just 24 hours after winning the title, he was forced to relinquish it. The company pivoted and eventually put the Universal Championship on Kevin Owens. Owens' eventual feud with Jericho became one of the best things on Raw, with plans for their feud to culminate at WrestleMania 33, with Jericho challenging Owens for the Universal Championship in one of the main event spots. But then WWE decided they wanted Goldberg versus Brock Lesnar for the Universal title instead. Owens lost his championship to Goldberg just a month before WrestleMania, and suddenly Jericho vs. Owens went from a Universal title main event to a United States title match that went on second. For Jericho, this was the final straw. He felt disrespected and undervalued after delivering some of his best work. Following his disappointing WrestleMania 33 experience, Chris Jericho made a decision that would change professional wrestling forever. In January 2018, Jericho shocked the world by appearing at New Japan Pro Wrestling to challenge Kenny Omega. This was Jericho's first match outside of WWE since 1999. The match was a critical and commercial success, proving that wrestling stars could thrive outside the WWE system. But the impact went far beyond just one match. When All Elite Wrestling launched in January 2019, Chris Jericho became the company's first world champion. His presence gave AEW instant credibility and legitimacy in the eyes of fans and the media. Without Jericho's willingness to leave WWE and take that risk with New Japan, Tony Khan might never have been inspired to create AEW, and it all traced back to Finn's shoulder injury at SummerSlam 2016. But Jericho wasn't the only wrestler whose departure was crucial to AEW's formation. In May 2016, Cody Rhodes left WWE after years of frustration. Despite being the son of the legendary Dusty Rhodes, WWE never saw him as a main event talent. He'd gone through multiple character changes, but nothing clicked. The final straw was being stuck as Stardust, a character that Cody absolutely hated. In 2016, for the first time in his career, Cody ventured outside the WWE bubble. He embarked on a worldwide tour that saw him wrestle for Ring of Honor, Impact Wrestling, and New Japan Pro Wrestling. But more importantly, he joined the Bullet Club alongside Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks, forming what would become known as the Elite. In 2017, wrestling journalist Dave Meltzer tweeted that Ring of Honor couldn't sell 10,000 tickets for an independent show. Cody and the Bucks took this as a personal challenge. Along with Kenny Omega and Hangman Page, they promoted an event called All In. The show was a massive success, drawing over 11,000 fans to the Sears Center in Chicago and 50,000 pay-per-view buys. This proved without a doubt that there was massive demand for a WWE alternative. Tony Khan, who was already planning a wrestling promotion, saw that the Elite had the star power needed to make his vision a reality. Within months, All Elite Wrestling was born, with Cody serving as an executive vice president and top star. None of this would have happened if WWE simply booked Cody better and kept him happy. But speaking of AEW, let's talk about a backstage incident that led to not one, but two huge WWE returns. In 2023, tensions between CM Punk and Jack Perry had been simmering for months. The situation exploded backstage at All In when the two got into a physical altercation following Punk's match. Reports indicated that Punk felt disrespected by Perry's actions during the match, leading to a confrontation. AEW owner Tony Khan witnessed the incident and made the difficult decision to terminate CM Punk's contract, ending what had been one of the most turbulent runs in recent wrestling history. After being fired from AEW, many wondered if his wrestling career was over. However, on November 25, 2023, at Survivor Series in Chicago, CM Punk made his shocking return to WWE after nearly a decade away. But the butterfly effect didn't stop there. Punk's return to WWE opened the door for another major comeback. AJ Lee, Punk's wife and a former WWE Divas champion who had been retired since 2015, made her surprise return in 2025 to team up with her husband. None of these returns happen if Jungle Jack simply kept his mouth shut. But moving on from AEW antics, let's talk about a recent WWE butterfly effect that changed the world title scene of WrestleMania. In early 2019, WWE was building towards something special on SmackDown. Daniel Bryan had reinvented himself as the planet's champion, and Mustafa Ali was being positioned as a top babyface challenger. Ali had impressed management with his underdog story, and the plan was for him to challenge Bryan for the title inside the Elimination Chamber. Everything was set for Ali's big moment. But then disaster struck when Ali suffered a concussion during a match that forced him out of action. WWE needed a replacement for the chamber match and turned to Kofi Kingston. What was supposed to be a simple substitution turned into something magical. At the Elimination Chamber, Kofi made it to the final two with Bryan, and even though he lost, the crowd gave him a standing ovation. The chants for Kofi grew louder each week, and WWE recognized they had struck gold. The company leaned into the story, creating parallels to Daniel Bryan's own rise in 2014. Over the following weeks, Kofi earned his WrestleMania 35 title shot, and at MetLife Stadium, in one of the most emotional moments in recent WrestleMania history, Kofi defeated Daniel Bryan to become WWE Champion after 11 years of hard work. It was the perfect underdog story, and it only happened because Mustafa Ali took a stiff kick from Randy Orton. But from Kofi's feel-good story, let's talk about one of the most unluckiest butterfly effects that completely destroyed a career. In 2007, Mr. Kennedy was on the verge of superstardom. He'd won the Money in the Bank briefcase at WrestleMania 23 and was being groomed as a future world champion. But then, Kennedy suffered an arm injury during a match. WWE's medical staff examined him and reported that he'd torn his tricep off the bone and would be out for 8 to 9 months. With Kennedy sidelined for the foreseeable future, WWE couldn't afford to keep the Money in the Bank briefcase on the shelf. They made the decision to have Kennedy drop the contract to Edge, who would go on to cash it in on The Undertaker as originally planned for Kennedy. Edge's subsequent feud with Undertaker became legendary and produced some of the best matches of both men's careers. But here's where the story takes a cruel twist. After Kennedy dropped the briefcase, WWE sent him for additional testing. The results came back and revealed that the original diagnosis was completely wrong. Kennedy didn't have a torn tricep at all. Instead, the injury was much less severe and he'd only be sidelined for 5 to 6 weeks. But by the time this was discovered, it was too late. Edge had already cashed in the Money in the Bank and Kennedy's main event push was gone. WWE tried to make it up to Kennedy later that year with an even bigger storyline. He was set to be revealed as Vince McMahon's illegitimate son in a major angle that would have made him a centerpiece of Raw. But Kennedy's luck ran out again when he was suspended for violating WWE's newly revised wellness policy. One misdiagnosis cost Kennedy a world championship run and potentially changed the entire trajectory of his career, while simultaneously leading to one of the most entertaining feuds in SmackDown history with Edge versus The Undertaker. Speaking of The Undertaker, did you know that Mark Henry was originally supposed to end Taker's streak at Mania 22? If WWE had gone ahead with the original plans, we'd never get the classic Taker versus HBK matches, plus the end of an era match at Mania 28 would have never happened. But while we're on the topic of Taker's streak, let's talk about the man who ended the streak. In the early 2000s, Brock Lesnar was positioned as the future of WWE. At just 25 years old, he became the youngest WWE champion in history. The plan was for Lesnar to dominate the main event scene for the next decade or more. But there was one problem nobody anticipated. Lesnar absolutely hated the WWE schedule. The constant travel, performing multiple times per week, dealing with injuries, and the overall grind of professional wrestling wore on Lesnar quickly. On March 8, 2004, Lesnar shocked the wrestling world by informing WWE he was leaving the company to pursue a career in the NFL. His departure happened at the worst possible time for SmackDown. Kurt Angle needed neck surgery after WrestleMania. Big Show was taking time off. Rock and Austin had left, and the company needed new stars to fill the main event scene. John Bradshaw Layfield, who'd been a mid-card tag team wrestler, was suddenly thrust into the main event scene and given the longest WWE championship reign in nearly a decade. Randy Orton's push was accelerated, making him the youngest world heavyweight champion at just 24 years old. Meanwhile, John Cena, who was already rising up the card, received an even bigger push in Lesnar's absence. Had Lesnar not left in 2004, Cena might have still become a star, but maybe not the record-breaking 17-time world champion who carried the company for years. Edge's career would have been drastically different too. He was often used to carry SmackDown during the late 2000s, but with Lesnar anchoring the brand, Edge might have remained in the upper mid-card. JBL would likely have been released rather than receiving the championship run that extended his career by years. Batista's rise to the main event might have been delayed, as WWE would have been less desperate for new top stars. One man's decision to leave because he couldn't handle the travel schedule created a domino effect that's still being felt 2 decades later. But while Lesnar's exit might have opened the door for Cena's rise to the top, let's talk about the time when Cena was almost shown the exit door out of the WWE. By the end of 2002, John Cena's WWE career was hanging by a thread. He'd debuted on SmackDown with a strong showing against Kurt Angle, but despite the initial momentum, Cena quickly faded into obscurity. He was just another generic wrestler with no defined character or personality. WWE management saw nothing special in him, and after just a few months on the roster, the company was preparing to release him. But then, fate intervened in the most unexpected way. During a European tour, WWE superstars were traveling on a bus, and Cena was freestyling with other wrestlers in the back. He was just having fun, showing off his rapping skills to kill time during the long ride. But Stephanie McMahon happened to overhear him, and something clicked. She saw potential in Cena's natural charisma and quick wit. Stephanie approached Cena and asked if he'd be interested in bringing a rapper character to television. Desperate to save his job, Cena immediately agreed, and this would lead to the infamous Doctor of Thugonomics gimmick that revived Cena's career. Just 2.5 years after that incident, Cena was WWE champion. He'd go on to carry the company during the PG era and even became a record-breaking 17-time world champion in the process. Think about how different WWE would look if Stephanie McMahon hadn't overheard Cena freestyling. But moving on from the PG and ruthless aggression era, let's talk about how a single decision in the 90s didn't just change WWE, it altered the entire landscape of professional wrestling and set off a chain reaction that's still influencing the business today. By 1996, both Nash and Hall had become major stars in WWF. Both men were valuable to WWF's future plans. However, WCW was making aggressive moves to compete with WWF. Eric Bischoff had launched Monday Nitro and was signing away WWF talent with lucrative contracts. When Bischoff approached Nash and Hall, he offered them something WWF couldn't match at the time: guaranteed contracts with significantly less dates. For wrestlers who were tired of the grueling WWF schedule, it was a no-brainer. They jumped ship to WCW, and their final WWF matches took place at a Madison Square Garden house show in May 1996. What happened next changed wrestling forever. Nash and Hall's departure led directly to the creation of the New World Order, where Hall and Nash invaded WCW as outsiders and eventually convinced Hulk Hogan to turn heel and join them, causing WCW's business to explode. Suddenly, WCW was beating WWF in the ratings every single week. The Monday Night Wars had truly begun, and WWF was losing badly. Hall and Nash leaving WWF set the stage for Stone Cold Steve Austin's rise. On their way out of the WWF, Nash and Hall broke kayfabe and shared a moment with their real-life friends, Shawn Michaels and Triple H, in an incident that came to be known as the Curtain Call. This led to Triple H being punished and Austin winning King of the Ring instead. Without that moment, Austin might never have delivered his Austin 3:16 promo or received the push that made him the biggest star in wrestling history. Think about how different the wrestling landscape would be if Nash and Hall had stayed. There's no NWO, which means WCW probably never becomes serious competition. Without serious competition, we never get the Monday Night Wars, and WWE never creates the Attitude Era. These are banned WWE moves that ended careers, starting with the Muscle Buster. Samoa Joe's finisher looked absolutely devastating, and unfortunately, it lived up to that reputation in the worst way possible. During a dark match in 2015, Joe hit the Muscle Buster on Tyson Kidd, and what should have been a routine night turned into a nightmare. Kidd suffered a spinal cord injury so severe that doctors said only 5% of people survive it. Joe's carried that regret with him ever since, calling it the biggest mistake of his career. And honestly, you can't blame WWE for pulling the plug immediately. The Muscle Buster was done in WWE for good, and Joe had to switch to the Coquina Clutch as his finisher. It's crazy how one split second can change everything. Kidd's career was over, Joe lost his signature move, and WWE learned a harsh lesson about just how dangerous certain moves can be. But while the Muscle Buster was banned for a legit safety reason, this next move got banned for one of the dumbest reasons in WWE history. The Burning Hammer was invented by Kenta Kobayashi in Japan and was so devastating that it literally won an award. Over the years, wrestlers modified it to make it safer, but even the safe version still puts you at serious risk of breaking your neck. Tyler Rex was using the Burning Hammer as his finisher in the early 2000s, and he'd never hurt anyone with it. But apparently, John Cena had a problem with the move, not because it was dangerous, but because he thought it looked too similar to his attitude adjustment. WWE told Rex he couldn't use the move anymore, and just like that, one of the most iconic finishers in wrestling history was gone from WWE for years, until AJ Styles eventually brought it back. But while Cena was protecting his finisher, WWE was about to ban a move that was actually putting people in the hospital. If you watched WWE during the Attitude Era and Ruthless Aggression Era, you know that chair shots to the head were one of the biggest highlights in any hardcore match. But Edge took it to another level with the Concerto. Edge made this move famous during his Rated R Superstar run, and it looked like something that could legitimately end someone's career. By 2010, WWE realized that unprotected chair shots to the head were causing serious long-term damage like CTE, concussions, and brain injuries that wrestlers would deal with for the rest of their lives. The concerto disappeared for years because it was just too intense and too dangerous. But here's the thing, Edge couldn't help himself. When he came back for his feud against Randy Orton in 2020, he pulled out the move one more time, and the fans lost their minds. However, speaking of Randy Orton, let's talk about his signature move that literally gave Vince McMahon a concussion. Randy Orton's punt kick was basically a field goal attempt using someone's skull as the football. Orton would stalk his opponent like a viper, wait for them to be on all fours, take a few steps back, and then he'd kick their head like he was trying to win the Super Bowl. But the problem? Randy wasn't faking it. His boot actually connected with people's heads, and the most famous victim was none other than Vince McMahon himself. Orton punted the chairman of WWE so hard that it literally gave Vince a legitimate concussion. After that, the move was banned in 2012. And honestly, you can't blame them. The punt kick looked cool, but it was genuinely dangerous, and there was no way to make it completely safe. But here's where it gets interesting. During the pandemic era, when there were no fans in the building, WWE brought the move back. Without a live crowd, Orton could take his time setting up the kick and make it look convincing while actually being safer. But while Orton's move got banned for actually hurting people, this next finisher got banned because Vince McMahon was worried about kids trying it at home. When AJ Styles first came to WWE, he brought with him one of the most unique finishers in wrestling, the Styles Clash. But Vince McMahon took one look at it and immediately hit the brakes. The move had a reputation for injuring people, and Vince wasn't about to risk it. AJ would flip his opponent upside down, hook their arms, and drive them face first into the mat. If the person taking the move tucked their chin or didn't keep their head up, they were basically asking for a broken neck. There had been a few scary incidents over the years where wrestlers got seriously hurt, and WWE wasn't trying to add to that list. So when AJ showed up, the Styles Clash was off limits. However, Chris Jericho decided to play hero. Jericho took the move multiple times, walked away fine every time, and eventually convinced WWE management that the move was safe when done correctly. Now AJ uses the Styles Clash regularly, and it's become one of the most protected finishers in WWE. But it took a WWE legend putting his neck on the line to make it happen. Speaking of neck injuries, this next move almost put The Undertaker in a wheelchair. The Brainbuster is a simple move in theory. It's basically a vertical suplex where you drop your opponent straight on their head instead of their back. But when it goes wrong, it goes really, really wrong. For years, WWE was cool with the move. Wrestlers used variations of it, and as long as you knew what you were doing, everything was fine. But then Super Showdown 2019 happened, and everything changed. Goldberg was scheduled to face The Undertaker in what should have been a legendary dream match. But instead, it turned into an absolute disaster that was painful to watch. Before the match even started, Goldberg headbutted a door and almost knocked himself out. During the match, Goldberg went for his signature jackhammer, but he was so gassed and out of it that he completely lost control. What was supposed to be a simple slam turned into the sloppiest, most dangerous brainbuster you've ever seen. Taker's head bounced off the mat at a horrible angle, and for a moment, everyone thought we just watched The Undertaker's career end in the worst way possible. That match was so bad and so dangerous that WWE said, enough is enough, and basically banned the brainbuster. These days, you rarely see anyone attempt it because nobody wants a repeat of that nightmare. But while Goldberg accidentally almost ended Taker's career, Seth Rollins took it to a whole another level. Seth Rollins' buckle bomb looked simple enough on paper. Just powerbomb your opponent into the corner turnbuckle. However, this move has ended more careers than almost any other in recent WWE history. The first major incident happened at Night of Champions 2015 when Seth faced Sting. Rollins hit the buckle bomb and Sting's neck hit the turnbuckle at the worst possible angle. The injury was so severe that Sting couldn't compete for years, and everyone thought his career was done for good. But WWE didn't ban the move yet. They chalked it up to a freak accident and let Seth keep using it. But fast forward to 2016, Seth used the buckle bomb at SummerSlam in the Universal title match and injured his opponent once again. That was the final straw. WWE had seen enough. The buckle bomb had now been responsible for retiring a legend and seriously injuring another performer. The move was banned completely, and Seth had to find new ways to finish his matches. But while the buckle bomb was eventually brought back, it wasn't the only move in Rollins' arsenal that was banned by the WWE. Seth Rollins' curb stomp was one of the most protected finishers in WWE for years. The move looked devastating, it was easy to hit out of nowhere, and fans absolutely loved it. Everything was going great until Seth won the WWE Championship at WrestleMania 31 by cashing in his Money in the Bank contract. Rollins was on top of the world, the new face of WWE, and he was about to do the media rounds as champion. The very next day, Seth appeared on the Today Show to promote WWE and show off his new title. During the segment, they played footage of him hitting the curb stomp to win the championship. Millions of people watching morning television saw Seth literally stomping someone's face into the ground. Vince McMahon saw this and completely freaked out. His first thought was, what if his grandkids start trying this on each other? Vince was terrified that WWE's new champion had a finisher that parents would absolutely hate. So just like that, the curb stomp was banned. Seth had to find a new finisher basically overnight, and fans were confused as to why one of the coolest moves in WWE suddenly disappeared. It took 3 years, but WWE eventually realized they were being ridiculous. In 2018, they brought the move back with one small change. Instead of calling it the curb stomp, they just called it the stomp. But while WWE was worried about kids imitating Seth's finisher, this next move got banned because it actually broke someone's face. CM Punk made the GTS absolutely iconic during his WWE run. Punk would lift his opponent onto his shoulders, throw them up in the air, and drive his knee straight into their face on the way down. It looked brutal, it was unique, and it became one of the most loved finishers in the company. But here's where things got complicated. When Punk left WWE in 2014, the company wanted nothing to do with anything that reminded fans of him. So when Hideo Itami showed up in NXT, WWE had a problem. Itami was the guy who basically invented the GTS in Japan. It was his move first, but WWE wouldn't let him use it because they didn't want fans chanting CM Punk's name. Eventually, WWE gave in and let Itami use the GTS. Finally, the inventor of the move could use his own finisher in WWE, but it didn't last long. During a match against Brian Kendrick, Itami hit the GTS and things went horribly wrong. Kendrick's face connected with Itami's knee at the worst possible angle, and the result was a broken nose, broken orbital bone, and Kendrick's face was completely messed up. That was enough for WWE to ban the move completely. For years, it looked like the GTS was done in WWE forever. Thankfully, when Punk finally returned, WWE let him bring back the GTS. But for a while there, one of the most iconic finishers in modern wrestling history was completely off limits. Speaking of iconic moves that WWE banned, let's talk about the most famous banned move in wrestling history. The piledriver is probably the most legendary banned move in all of wrestling, and for very good reason. At SummerSlam 1997, Owen Hart was facing Stone Cold Steve Austin in a match that was going as usual. However, when Owen went for a piledriver, something went terribly wrong. Instead of Austin's head stopping safely above the mat, Owen dropped him directly on his neck. Stone Cold said he couldn't feel anything from the neck down after the move. For a moment, he genuinely thought he'd never walk again. The Rattlesnake did eventually return to the ring, but his career was significantly shortened because of that one botched piledriver. One of the biggest stars in wrestling history had his prime years cut short because of a move that went wrong. After that incident, WWE realized just how dangerous the piledriver actually was. The margin for error was so small, one tiny mistake and you could paralyze someone. So the standard piledriver was banned across the board in 2000. However, there were exceptions. The Undertaker and Kane were allowed to keep using their tombstone piledriver variations because they'd perfected the move over years and never hurt anyone. CM Punk once used the piledriver against John Cena in a match on Raw. Kevin Owens used his package piledriver on Cody Rhodes. But the standard piledriver still remains banned in today's WWE. However, while the piledriver has a tragic history behind its ban, this next move on our list got banned because of how dangerous it looked. The vertebreaker is one of those moves that makes you wonder what wrestler was crazy enough to invent it in the first place. Shane Helms, better known as the Hurricane, used this move during his time in WCW, and it looked absolutely insane. Helms would hook both of his opponent's arms behind their back, flip them upside down, and then drop straight down, driving their face and neck into the mat. When done correctly, it looked devastating. When done incorrectly, you were basically asking to break someone's neck. Helms brought the vertebreaker with him when he jumped to WWE, but WWE took one look at the move and immediately shut it down. However, Seth Rollins used it once against AJ Styles at a house show, and most recently, we've seen Cody Rhodes use a safer version of the move in the WWE. It's one of the most spectacular moves in wrestling history, but it's also one of the most dangerous. Speaking of spectacular, check out this video to relive the spectacular year of 2005 in the WWE.